Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere cold, like your breath freezes in mid-air cold. Like, if you spill water it shatters cold. Welcome to your first winter as a frontier settler. You're new out here, just a few months into the wilderness, and already regretting some choices. The land is beautiful, sure. Trees whisper in a language older than anything you've heard before. The stars stretch wider than your imagination. But now the sun is vanishing earlier, and a creeping chill seeps into everything, even your bones. And guess what? You probably won't survive this. But hey, let's pretend. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, what time is it and where are you listening from? I always love hearing about your little nighttime corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts in late October. You've barely finished building your first rough log cabin. No insulation, no proper windows, and a door that groans in protest every time you touch it. There's a fireplace, but the chimney still smokes wrong and fills the room with a haze that stings your eyes and turns every item of clothing into a campfire-scented relic. Your fingertips are cracked. Your lips chapped into oblivion. And nightfall isn't waiting for you to figure it all out. At first, it's kind of charming. You cook stew over the fire, wrap yourself in whatever blankets you brought from back east, and tell stories by the flickering flame. You imagine this must be what freedom feels like. But the temperature keeps falling. One night, you wake to find your water bucket frozen solid, indoors. The next morning, you step outside and hear the snow crunch, not with a soft puff, but a sharp crackle like brittle glass underfoot. The first real frontier winter doesn't knock. It kicks down the door and sets up camp, and you are not ready. Here's your first brutal truth. Every mistake in winter costs more. Forget to close the door all the way. Now your fire's dead. Use green wood by accident. Enjoy coughing your lungs out from the smoke. Step outside without gloves for too long. Say goodbye to feeling in those fingers. And when the cold settles in, it's not dramatic or loud, it's quiet. That's the worst part. It crawls in under your collar. It rides in your breath. It waits. You're trying to stretch supplies, because of course you are. The nearest trading post is a 2-day ride. And that's if the trails haven't vanished under drifts of snow and windblown trees. That horse you rode in on? He's huddled in a lean-to, probably questioning life choices too. You feed him what little grain you have, wrap his hooves in burlap, and pray he makes it through the week. Inside the cabin, you learn how to live in a constant state of layering. You wear all your clothes at once, like some absurd fashion nightmare, and still shiver while you sleep. You tuck your feet against the dog, if you're lucky enough to have one. You fall asleep dreading the moment the fire dies and dreaming of sunshine that never comes. You try building better routines. You become obsessed with firewood. It becomes more valuable than gold. Every waking hour is a calculation. Do we have enough wood to make it through the night? Can you chop more before the sun dips too low and the forest becomes a black maze of creaks and howls? One historical account from the early 1800s talks about a family in Vermont who used to keep the chickens under the bed in winter to share the warmth. You read that now, and maybe chuckle, but once the cold gets in your bones, it doesn't seem so silly. You'd invite a whole barnyard into bed with you if it meant surviving another night. There's a quirkier fact buried in an old settler diary. One man claimed he could tell how cold it was outside by whether his beard froze to the cabin wall while he slept. Sounds ridiculous, until you try sharing a bed pressed against frost-covered logs and realise your breath turns the inside wall into an icy mirror. And still, some people debate just how severe those winters really were. Some historians argue the records exaggerate, that memory and storytelling play up the hardship to make heroes out of ancestors. But others, they point to actual ice core data, early climate shifts during the 19th century, and say no, these people weren't embellishing. They were just barely hanging on. You start to learn what they knew. That survival doesn't come from being the toughest. It comes from being clever, from listening to the land, copying the habits of animals, watching how frost forms and wind shifts. You use everything. Rags stuffed in cracks, ashes mixed with mud for insulation, coats made of patched together pelts. You learn to burn different woods at different times. Light pine first for kindling, then oak or hickory once the fire's strong. The sun rises late and sets early. You mark time by the smoke curling out of the chimney and the sound of your own breath in the silence. Sometimes you talk just to hear something human. And when the wind howls across the hills at night, it sounds like voices calling out from the dark. You start to understand why so many frontier diaries mention singing, Soft lullabies, old hymns, even nonsense songs. Anything to keep spirits from cracking. You hum to yourself while stacking wood, while patching leaks in the roof, while watching the fire and hoping it holds through the night. By December, the first true storm rolls in. You hear it coming before you see it. Trees groaning, the world growing muffled as snow thickens the air. You bar the door. You pack snow along the outer walls to block the wind. You eat a dinner of hard bread soaked in broth and hope it won't run out before the thaw. That night, the fire sputters. You wrap yourself tighter, listen to the storm outside, and try not to think about how thin the logs are, how low the woodpile's getting. You stare at the glowing embers and wonder what spring will feel like, if it ever comes. Welcome to the frontier winter. This is just the beginning. You learn quickly that survival out here is all about timing, and your timing, if we're being brutally honest, kind of sucks. That cabin you're huddled in, thrown together in a rush, barely holding out the cold. You started building too late in the season, thinking the fall would stretch longer than it did. One minute the leaves were golden, fluttering down like confetti from the trees, and the next, you were smashing frozen ground with a shovel and realizing that hard as a rock is not just a metaphor. The cabin had to go up fast, no fancy nails, no mill-cut lumber, just logs notched by hand with a dull axe and sweat that turned icy as soon as it hit the air. You got blisters on your blisters, and the chinking, the mud and moss mixture you stuffed between logs to block the wind, yeah, that's flaking out now, literally. Every time the wind howls, little pieces of your wall crumble onto the floor like it's trying to return to nature. Which honestly, it kind of is. You didn't get a roof on until the first snow. There was one night you had to throw a canvas tarp over your head and pray it didn't collapse on you in your sleep. The next morning you woke up covered in a light dusting of snow inside. Magical in theory. Miserable in practice. There's no blueprint. You're going off instinct, memory, and maybe a smudged diagram in an old farmer's almanac. The door doesn't close right. The corners aren't square. There's a mysterious draft that seems to come from everywhere at once. Still, it's standing. And that's more than a lot of settlers could say. One frontier journal from an Illinois homesteader described building a cabin in just 5 days before the frost hit. The roof, bark and dirt. The floor, still grass and mud. The man's wife gave birth inside that structure while wind came through the seams. She wrapped the baby in rabbit pelts and hoped the wolves stayed on the other side of the trees. Now that's real rustic. There's something strange that happens to you after a few weeks in a barely holding cabin. You start to get proud. You know every squeak in the logs, every knot in the wood, every loose board that needs wedging in place with a rock or piece of firewood. It's a mess, but it's your mess. And when the wind howls and you stay dry, you count it as a win, even if your breath still fogs in the air indoors. No glass for windows, of course. Too expensive, too fragile, too unnecessary according to the older settlers. You just leave openings, maybe cover them with greased paper or stretched animal bladder, translucent enough to let in a sliver of light, not enough to keep out the cold. But by the time snow starts banking against the outside, you're grateful for anything that slows the wind. Of course, building in winter is its own kind of absurd punishment. Some people had no choice. A fringe survival account from Michigan tells of a family who lived in a dugout for half a year. Literally a hole in the side of a hill, covered with logs and dirt. No chimney, just a hole in the top for smoke to leak through. Snow would melt over the fire, then refreeze as it slid down the back wall. The kids called it the drip house, honestly. Compared to your current shack, it might have been cozy. What historians still debate is how much of this struggle was planned versus sheer desperation. Did people truly believe they were prepared? Or were they gambling every season, hoping the weather held just a few more weeks? Some argue that early settlers were overly optimistic, blinded by dreams of free land and freedom. Others suggest they were realists, just hardened people who knew how to suffer through a storm with grit and grit alone. Either way, the result is the same. Your first winter is a gauntlet, a long, slow contest of how much discomfort can you endure before losing your mind. And it all hinges on whether or not your little log box can keep you alive. You start modifying the structure as the days grow shorter. You stuff gaps with moss and rabbit fur. You reinforce weak spots with extra boards or even spare clothing. You angle the roof to let snow slide off, and when it doesn't, you climb up with a broom and pray you don't slide off into a snowdrift. Inside, you arrange everything for heat. Bed closest to the fireplace. Food nearby so you don't waste precious warmth walking across the room. The firewood pile, right next to the door, stacked in a panic every afternoon. And yes, you start to rank your wood pieces by size and shape. The thick logs for all-night burns, the twisted ones for fast kindling, the pine for when you need flame now. You learn to be creative with what little space you have, hooks in the beams to hang drying socks, ropes to keep pots from tipping on uneven hearthstones, a barrel near the corner for melted snow you can drink, assuming it doesn't freeze overnight and become an ice sculpture by morning. At night, dan, the cabin creaks, loudly. The cold shrinks the wood and pulls everything tight, so every shift in temperature makes the logs groan like old bones. Sometimes you sit up in the dark, sure someone's outside, only to realise it's just your shack stretching its joints in protest. You talk to the cabin eventually, not in a weird way. Well, okay, kind of in a weird way, but it becomes your only real companion. When the wind howls and snow hammers the walls, you whisper, "Hold together, just one more night." And sometimes the cabin listens. That bond between you and this patchwork shelter is what gets you through the worst. It's not about comfort, it's about protection. Your cabin doesn't care how you feel, but it blocks the wind, it holds the fire, and when you press your back against the logs, cold as they are, you feel grounded, held. Not warm exactly, but not alone. And out here, that counts for more than you think. The fire is your lifeline, your fickle, smoky, temperamental best friend. Without it, you're done. And unfortunately, building a good hearth on the frontier is less a science and more of an improvisational art with high-stakes consequences. You probably thought a fireplace was just a hole in the wall with rocks around it. Cute. You'll learn fast that there's a difference between something that looks like a fireplace and one that doesn't try to kill you in your sleep. It all starts with the chimney, or more often, the excuse for one. You throw it together with fieldstone, if you're lucky enough to have any nearby, or clay and sticks if you're desperate. Some settlers even tried building their chimneys entirely out of wood, slathered in a coat of mud that would hopefully keep it from igniting. Spoiler, sometimes it didn't. A smouldering wall wasn't an uncommon smell. Smoke is your first teacher, and it is ruthless. If your chimney's angle is wrong, if the drawer isn't strong enough, if the opening's too narrow or the room too small, the smoke doesn't go up. It goes sideways, into your lungs, into your blankets, into your soul. You wake up coughing, eyes stinging, and every item of clothing permanently smells like burnt pine. You become a living piece of jerky. There's this magical phrase, smoke shelf, that carpenters love to toss around. Supposedly it helps direct airflow, improves draw, makes the fire breathe better. But out here, you don't have time for elegant drafts and fine-tuned masonry. You're stuffing kindling under logs and praying the flames move upward. Sometimes they do, sometimes they roar out into the room like a dragon with a grudge. A historical note from an 1820s settler in Ohio mentions having to dismantle and rebuild their fireplace 3 times before it stopped poisoning them. The solution. They finally gave up on design and just made the opening huge. Half the wall, really. It burned through wood faster than a campfire during a windstorm, but at least they stopped choking every morning. You notice little tricks. A hotter fire draws better, but eats through fuel too fast. A wider hearth keeps sparks from leaping into your bedding, but lets more heat escape. A narrow throat traps smoke. A tall chimney might collapse if the mortar freezes and cracks, and if you build it too low, the snow will bury the top and seal the draft completely, which is a fun surprise in the middle of a blizzard. Still, despite the dangers, the fireplace is the one corner of the cabin that feels like home. The flicker of light on the walls, the pop of sap in the logs, the soft coals glowing red. There's a hypnotic rhythm to it. You sit close to it at night, back arched toward the warmth like a cat, and just stare into it. You get lost there. You think about your life back east, about the things you left, about what in the world you thought you were chasing when you came out here to play pioneer. And then the fire goes out and the cold punches you square in the teeth. Keeping it burning through the night becomes your new obsession. You experiment. You try burying larger logs in the coals, raking ashes over embers to insulate them, building teepees or crisscross stacks made like you're back in Scouts, except this time failure isn't embarrassing. It's dangerous. It's final. You start sleeping in shifts, not because you want to, but because someone has to watch the fire. If you're alone, that someone is you and your sleep becomes a choppy, half-conscious haze. If there's more than one of you, you set a rotation. One person up every few hours to feed the fire, check the chimney, make sure the logs haven't rolled out onto the floor in some act of fiery rebellion. And yes, that happens more than you'd like. Some nights your dreams bleed into the fire. You see faces in the coals, hear voices whispering from the smoke. Not ghosts exactly, but memories. Old laughter, distant songs. That strange blend of heat and exhaustion plays tricks on your mind. You wake up not knowing what time it is, or even what day. There's an old superstition among frontier folks that if your fire ever fully dies in the night, something is allowed in. Not cold, not darkness, something. They don't name it, but they never let the fire go out even when they barely have fuel left. You think about that sometimes when the wind rattles the shutters and the fire dips low. You stir the embers quickly, just in case. Now here's something unexpected. You start using fire not just for heat, but for everything. Drying wet boots, thawing out food, sterilizing tools, heating rocks to toss under blankets before bed, boiling snow for water. Once, in a moment of desperation, you even used the coals to warm up your shirt before putting it on. You nearly burn yourself, but it was worth it. You start to think of fire not just as a source of comfort, but a tool, a resource, a living thing you have to feed and care for. There's a quirky method some old-timers swore by, placing flat rocks near the flames until they're piping hot, then wrapping them in cloth and sticking them at the foot of the bed. Basically prehistoric hot water bottles. Some even heated bricks during the day and brought them into bed with the kids at night. It works, kind of. The rocks stay warm for a couple of hours, then become dead weight. Still, on nights when the wind whistles through the cracks and your toes feel like wood, that bit of warmth makes the difference between sleep and shivering until dawn. Scholars still argue about whether frontier fireplaces were actually well designed, or just glorified smoke holes. Some say the design improved over time, borrowing from indigenous fire building techniques, or adapted from German and Scandinavian settlers, more efficient stoves. Others claim that most folks just did whatever worked, and survived through sheer stubbornness and the willingness to rebuild it again and again every time it failed. You get used to smelling like soot. It seeps into your skin, into your bedding, into your hair. You stop noticing after a while until someone visits, or you make it to town and the difference hits you like a wall. You smell like the inside of a chimney, because essentially that's what your home is. Still, there are moments, rare, fleeting, when the fire is just right. The room is warm, the logs are hissing softly, the wind outside sounds miles away, and you sit there, shoulders hunched toward the warmth, and think, maybe this was worth it. You pull your blanket tighter, listen to the logs shift and settle, and drift into another shallow sleep, hoping the flames last long enough to carry you through till morning. You discover a whole new kind of fashion on the frontier, the kind born not from style, but survival. Forget everything you ever knew about layering. Out here, you don't just wear clothes, you build them. Every layer is like laying brick in a wall between you and the creeping cold. And the truth is, if you get it wrong, you'll feel it instantly. The cold out here doesn't tap politely on your shoulder. It lunges at your chest and tries to crawl into your spine. The standard wardrobe becomes a ridiculous pile of scratchy wool, patched cotton, and animal hides. Socks over socks, shirts over shirts. You wrap your legs in flannel or old grain sacks. You sleep in your hat, and if you're smart, you never ever take your boots off unless you're sure they'll be dry in the morning. Wet boots are a death sentence waiting to happen. The kind of mistake you only make once, and only if you're lucky enough to survive it. Your outer layer is the most critical. Wool is king out here, thick, heavy, and not remotely fashionable, but it holds warmth even when damp. Then there are the pelts. Rabbit, raccoon, fox, whatever you can trap, scrape and stitch. You learn fast that animal fur isn't just warm, it's smarter than you. Nature figured this out way before humans tried their hand at winter fashion. A popular trick among frontier kids was stuffing dry grass inside their clothing, makeshift insulation that itched like fire ants but did the job. Some settlers even used corn husks, not comfortable, not glamorous, but surprisingly effective. There's an old settler saying, "The more you rustle, the warmer you are." And it's true. If you sound like you're smuggling a haystack every time you move, you're probably surviving. And yet there's a line, dress too heavily and you sweat. Sweat out here is betrayal. Once your body moisture soaks into your clothes, it freezes. And now, instead of warmth, you've got a layer of icy regret plastered to your chest. You start learning the delicate dance between not freezing and not sweating, even during the most basic tasks like hauling water or chopping wood. Some settlers tried oiling their outerwear with animal fat or beeswax to keep moisture out. One quirky method involved rubbing bear grease into mittens and boots, which kept things waterproof, sure, but also made you smell like bait. That's a bold fashion statement when wolves are nearby. Mittens are another battlefield. Gloves offer dexterity, but mittens trap heat better. You choose warmth. Always warmth. Sometimes, if you're desperate, you wear both. Gloves inside mittens, hands wrapped in cloth and shoved into a wool sock like a sad little burrito. You can't hold an axe properly, but at least your fingers stay attached. Footwear is a constant problem. Leather boots stiffen and crack from the cold. Laces snap like twigs. You wrap your feet in layers of wool, fur and anything dry you can find. Old newspapers, if you're lucky enough to have them. You've never been so grateful for useless reading material. You dry socks by the fire at night, rotating them like sacred relics. One bad pair of socks in freezing weather, and you're staring down frostbite with nothing but a dull knife and a vague idea of how many toes you actually need. There's a historical account of a woman in the Dakotas who made coats from multiple old quilts, stitched together like a patchwork beast. She called it her walking bed. Her husband joked that she disappeared into it every time the temperature dropped, and sometimes she did, wearing it even while sleeping, to avoid ever having to face the cold alone. Historians still debate how effective frontier clothing really was. Some argue people adapted brilliantly to the environment, incorporating indigenous designs like fur-lined moccasins or layered robes. Others say most settlers stumbled into winter ill-equipped and survived only through improvisation and pure willpower. You can see both sides. One day you feel like a genius for sewing fur inside your collar. The next, you're crying over the frozen buttons that won't close because your fingers stopped working. Even indoors, you stay layered. The cabin might be warm near the fire, but stray 2 steps away, and your breath fogs in front of your face. You wear your coat to bed. You keep your hat on while cooking. Removing a single layer becomes a risk assessment. You only undress when you're near the fire, and even then you do it fast, like you're in a competition against the air itself. And the laundry? Don't make me laugh. Winter laundry is the stuff of nightmares. Water freezes before you can even rinse. Clothes turn into rigid, frosted sculptures. You start to live by the old phrase, dirt don't hurt. If something doesn't smell like death or mould, it gets worn again, and again and again. A fringe fact. Some people slept naked under their clothes and blankets to let body heat transfer directly to the bedding. Supposedly it kept things warmer. You try it once, and it's an experience. An icy, terrifying, what have I done kind of experiment that leaves you scurrying back into your 3 shirts and 2 pairs of pants with a new appreciation for every single thread. You become intimately aware of your own heat loss. You feel it leaving your wrists, ankles, neck. You build your wardrobe around sealing those gaps. Scarves, head wraps, even strips of torn shirts tied around your boots. You're not dressing to impress anyone. You're dressing like someone who has stared into the abyss of a frostbitten morning and said, not today, and still, sometimes it's not enough. Some nights you shiver no matter what. You curl into yourself like a comma and breathe warm air into your hands buried deep inside your coat. You listen to the wind whistle outside and think just a little longer. You count the layers you're wearing and wonder how many more it would take to actually feel human again. But in the darkest parts of winter, when every breath feels like glass and every movement aches, the one thing between you and the end is your armour of threadbare fabric and stitched together fur. You're ridiculous, you're rustling, you're wrapped in everything you own, and somehow you're still here. You think snow is the enemy out here, the villain of this long frozen tale. But as strange as it sounds, snow can save you. It's not just the thing falling from the sky and turning your world into a slippery, blinding, ankle-breaking mess. It's also insulation. Actual, functional, magical insulation. Once you get over the shock of living in a world where your eyelashes freeze together, you start to notice something. The cabin is warmer when it's buried. It doesn't happen all at once. The first few snowfalls are light, almost decorative, like powdered sugar on a nightmare. But then comes that big one, the dump. The storm that drops 2 feet overnight, traps your shovel under a drift, and seals your door shut with a heavy sigh. And that's when you feel it. With snow piled high against the outside walls, the wind stops screaming. The cabin gets quieter. The cracks stop leaking cold air like angry ghosts. The logs stop groaning. It's like someone wrapped your home in a muffled icy blanket. You learn to appreciate it, this bizarre partnership with snow. Sure, it tries to kill you when you walk through it. It eats your boots. It hides your firewood. It turns paths into pits and outhouses into snow-covered mysteries. But pressed up against your walls, it actually helps. You realise that the snow acts like Earth's version of foam insulation. It doesn't care about you, but it does trap heat. There's a trick some seasoned settlers knew. After a big snow, they'd pack more against the cabin walls, smoothing it into little hills like white sandbags. It sounds counterintuitive, putting more snow on something you're trying to keep warm, but it works. You do it yourself and notice the difference overnight. The inside doesn't feel like a meat locker anymore, just a moderately uncomfortable icebox. It's not just the walls either. You use snow as windbreaks, you shovel it into half walls around the latrine, you build banks around the chicken coop to keep the wind off the animals. One particularly windy week, you even try burying part of the woodpile, hoping the snow will protect it from the worst of the freeze. It does, sort of, though the logs become so hard you have to use the axe just to break them loose. That leads to the weirdest realization of all. Snow has rules. There's dry snow and wet snow. Powdery drifts that float and stick to your face, and heavy slop that clings to your boots and drags you down like an anchor. You get good at reading it. You learn to predict how much longer you've got before the sky drops another batch. You become the kind of person who knows the weight of snow just by the sound it makes when you step in it. A soft foof? Probably good for insulation. A sharp crunch? Bitter cold, no forgiveness. One fringe method you hear about involves building actual snow shelters. Not just for emergencies, some people lived in them for entire winters. Settlers in extreme regions or trappers on the move would carve out snow caves, even shape little domes like improvised igloos. You scoff at the idea until one day a freak storm forces you to dig into a drift just to stay upright. You crawl into a hollowed out space, heart pounding, and feel the wind vanish. Inside that tiny frozen cave, the world is muted. Warmer. Safer. You sit there for an hour, wondering if the snow is protecting you or just waiting to collapse. You remember an old frontier tale about a family who had to dig their way out of their house after a 3-day storm buried the cabin up to the roof. They tunneled through the drift like moles, emerging into a silent, blinding world. Some historians argue the story is exaggerated, but based on your current situation, you're not so sure. There's still debate among scholars about how much settlers knew about snow's insulating properties versus just stumbling into it. Some say it was common sense passed down from Native Americans and observed in animal behaviour. Foxes curling into drifts, rabbits tunneling under snowbanks. Others believe settlers learnt the hard way, one blizzard at a time, by noticing which cabins stayed warmer and copying them. Either way, the knowledge stuck. Even the way you walk changes. Snow teaches you to step differently. You lift your feet higher, place them slower, always watching for hidden holes or weak crust. You dread post-holing, that moment when one foot plunges through to your thigh and you're stuck like a cork in a bottle. You learn to tie twine around your boots to stop snow from pouring in, and every time you fall, because you will fall, you curse, laugh and roll up like a sad snowman. And then there's the quiet. The kind of silence only snow can bring. Thick, heavy, complete. You step outside after a storm and it's like the world has stopped breathing. No birds, no wind, just the faint hiss of flakes brushing against each other. It's beautiful and eerie. You find yourself whispering for no reason, like speaking too loud might wake something ancient beneath the ice. You start using snow in little ways too, for water when you're desperate and your barrel's frozen solid. For washing, if you can't stand your own smell anymore and need a cold slap back into humanity. You toss a handful into your soup pot and pretend it's the same as clean water. You know it's not. You know the snow's full of ash, soot and probably bits of fur, but out here you make peace with that. A quirky fact you come across in a dog-eared wilderness guide: snow, in small doses, can be boiled and filtered to make perfectly drinkable water, but eating it raw? Dangerous. It lowers your core temperature. You test that theory one morning, chewing a handful of fresh powder after splitting wood, and within 5 minutes your teeth ache and your body starts to shiver. Lesson learned, again. As winter drags on, you come to see snow not just as weather, but as a character in your life. A moody, temperamental roommate that sometimes helps, sometimes hinders, and always overstays its welcome. Is not your enemy, but it's definitely not your friend. Still, when you wake one morning and see the snowbank outside your window glowing soft pink in the sunrise, you forget all that for a moment. It looks like sugar glass, like magic. You press your hand to the cold log wall and smile. Maybe the snow isn't trying to kill you. Maybe it's just testing you. Eventually, you run out of wood at the exact wrong time, because of course you do. It's always in the middle of the night, always during a cold snap, and always when you finally manage to drift into the kind of exhausted sleep that only comes after spending 16 hours wrapped in wool, trudging through snow, and eating something that might have once been a turnip. And then, the fire starts to sputter. The last log shifts, pops, collapses into a pathetic pile of glowing orange crumbs. You feel the temperature fall instantly, like someone opened a trapdoor to the Arctic right under your blanket. So you do what you've been dreading all day. You throw the covers off, roll out of bed with a grunt, and stagger toward the woodpile, only to realise you've already burned the last of what was inside. You forgot. Or someone forgot. Doesn't matter. Now it's either freeze or go out in the dark to find more. You wrap yourself like a burrito of desperation. Coat, scarf, mittens. Boots still damp from the day before. You grab the lantern, but it flickers weakly, the oil running low. The wind pushes against the cabin door the second you open it, and snow blasts into your face like a slap. This isn't a gentle flurry, this is punishment. The kind of weather that gets whispered about in back corners of general stores years later. And yet you head outside, because you have to. Because the fire is your heart and the cabin's warmth is your bloodstream. And both are fading fast. The woodpile, what's left of it, is half buried under a crust of snow and ice. You dig at it with stiff gloves, breathing hard, your exhale curling around your face like a ghost. You find a couple of decent-sized logs, drag them loose, then a few twisted branches for kindling. Your fingers are already numb, and your thighs sting from the cold like the wind's peeling your skin right off. By the time you stumble back inside, cheeks burning and boots clumping with frozen snow, you're shaking, not just from cold, but from adrenaline. The kind of deep, primal stress that your body throws at you when it realises you're close, too close to the edge. You shove the kindling into the hearth like a sacrifice. You blow, gently at first, then harder. The embers resist. You curse them under your breath. You talk to them, plead with them. You strike a match, the flame dim and fragile, and when the fire finally flares back to life, there's a sense of triumph that feels almost ridiculous. You survived. Again, just barely. It happens more than once. The almost out of wood panic. You try to keep ahead of it. You make a new rule. If you're awake and you see the pile getting low, you refill it. No excuses, no forgetting. You don't let it get below knee-high without doing something about it. Because now you understand just how close the fire lives to death, and how much that death looks like you, frozen in your sleep. Woodcutting becomes the central obsession of your day. You dream about splitting logs. You measure time in chords. The axe becomes a fifth limb, and the sound of it cracking through wood is the closest thing to music you've got. You become an artist of angles. You learn which wood burns fastest, pine, but it spits sap, and which burns longest, oak, if you can split it without cursing the entire forest. One settler story tells of a man who chopped wood every day for 9 months straight. Even in July, terrified that his family would freeze if he ever stopped. By winter's end, he'd built a wall of firewood so tall his neighbours thought he was mad. But his cabin stayed warm, and none of them laughed when January came and their own piles dwindled. You start stashing wood everywhere, behind the cabin, under the eaves, inside baskets, stacked in the corners like weird wooden furniture. You even bring a few pieces into bed one night, too tired to restock the pile and too cold to leave them outside. At that point, firewood becomes as intimate to you as food or breath. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much fuel a typical frontier family actually needed to survive the winter. Some say 5 cords, others say 8, even 10 if it was a long one. But the truth is you can't measure it exactly. Every winter is different. Every family has different needs. Some nights are mild. Others feel like they want to crack your cabin in half. The only real rule? It's never enough. Always cut mark more. A fringe trick you try involves burning green wood overnight. Not because it burns better, it doesn't, but because it burns slower. If you stack it right with dry logs underneath, the moisture keeps it from going up too fast. It smoulders, stays hot longer. Of course, it also smokes like a cursed chimney and smells like boiled bark. But if it keeps the cabin from turning into a meat locker, you'll live with it. Eventually you get smart, you build a little covered lean-to just for storing your dry wood. Nothing fancy, 4 pates, a sloped roof, maybe a tarp tacked over the front. But it keeps the worst of the snow out, and that makes a difference. You store kindling in a box indoors now, always dry, always ready. You tie a bundle of cedar shavings with string and hang it by the hearth like fire insurance. And yet, some nights still get away from you. You misjudge, the wood burns faster than expected. The wind sneaks under the cabin, pulling away the heat. You wake up with your breath clouding in front of your face and your fingers stiff again. It doesn't matter how much you prepare, winter finds your weak spots. It always does. A quirky detail from an old trapper's guide mentions people using their own furniture for firewood when things got desperate. You think that's exaggerated, Pooh? Until one bitter February night you look at the leg of the table and wonder, just for a second, how long it would burn. The truth is, fire is more than just heat out here. It's your protector, your companion. It's also your captor. You're tethered to it, obsessed with feeding it, shaped by it. You build your days around keeping it alive. You go outside when you don't want to. You chop wood when your hands are already bleeding. You do it all because without it, you're just another settler-shaped icicle in the woods. So you keep the fire going, through the long nights, through the quiet snowfalls and the howling storms, through the hunger, the isolation, the exhaustion, because as long as there's flame in the hearth, there's still a you in that cabin. You stop sleeping like a normal person sometime in January. There's no 8-hour stretch, no dreams about sunny meadows or feather beds. Sleep comes in shifts now, half sleeps, fire-watching naps. And that weird kind of consciousness, where you're not sure if you're awake or just listening to the crackle of the hearth from deep inside a blanket cocoon. Either way, you're tired, all the time. Your body aches in places you didn't know could ache. Your eyes sting from smoke and fatigue, but the fire needs tending, and no one else is volunteering at 3 a.m. You tried full nights of sleep in the beginning. Thought if you banked the fire just right, tossed in a few thick logs and piled ashes over the coals, it'd hold till dawn. It never did. The fire would gutter out around 2 a.m, and by the time you woke up, the inside of the cabin would feel like a forgotten meat locker. You'd curse yourself, leap from bed, stub your toe on the stove, and scramble to relight frozen kindling with hands that could barely move. Once was enough to convince you. Sleeping through the night was a luxury you no longer had. So now you sleep in shifts. If you're alone, you just don't sleep deeply, never more than an hour or two at a time. You keep a stick by the bed to poke the logs from under the covers. You've become nocturnal in a way, stirring embers, while the rest of the world lies silent beneath blankets of snow. But if there are others, family, friends, that one neighbour who moved in 2 miles down the trail, you organise a rotation. Everyone gets a turn, even the kids if they're old enough. It sounds fair in theory, till someone falls asleep on the job. The fire dies. You wake up freezing, and then you're all shouting at each other in the dark, wrapped in quilts like angry ghosts. It's not just about staying warm, it's about not dying. And everyone knows it. There's a routine now. The firekeeper gets up, stokes the coals, adds wood, checks the draft on the chimney, maybe brews tea or thaws a leftover biscuit on the hearthstone. Sometimes you sit there for an hour after tending the fire, watching the shadows on the walls, your own breath drifting like smoke in the dim light. It's quiet, strangely peaceful. You listen to the wind outside, the occasional creak of a tree giving way under ice, the shifting weight of snow on the roof. In the dead of winter, night feels like it lasts forever. The sun sets around 4, barely peeking above the treetops by 9. Time turns strange. You measure it in firelight and the feel of the cabin walls. And the longer you're awake during those hours, the more you hear things. Small sounds, odd echoes. You swear you can hear the snow falling sometimes, or the whisper of wind slipping through the chimney flue. One night you think you hear someone humming, but no one else is awake. Probably the wind, hopefully. There's an old frontier belief that the night fire is sacred, that it keeps more than cold at bay. In some cultures, the hearth wasn't just heat, it was protection. Let the fire die, and you risk inviting things in, not just animals, but others. You don't put much stock in superstition, but still, you keep that fire alive, just in case. A strange fact from an 1840s survival guide mentions keeping small coals in a metal box to carry between cabins, an early portable heater, like a glowing lunchbox of life. Some families even kept clay pots of embers under their beds. One spark too strong and the whole place would go up, but it was worth the risk to stay warm, to keep the fire close. You start to learn the personalities of the firewood, the quick-burning kindling, the slow-burning heartwood. You know how long a piece will last based on its weight, the sound it makes when you tap it against the floor. You can tell in your bones how much longer the current stack will hold. Fire becomes a sixth sense. There's something strange that happens during these night shifts. Time stretches. You think more. You remember people, places, things you haven't let yourself think about in weeks. You sit beside the fire and let your mind wander down frozen trails of memory, warmed just enough to keep going. You write letters in your head, compose stories you'll never tell. You wonder what it would be like to fall asleep and wake up somewhere warm, just once, without the pressure of keeping everything from freezing. It's also when the real loneliness creeps in. Even if you're not alone in the cabin, the night shift isolates you. The rest are bundled in dreams, murmuring under layers of patched quilts. You watch over them like some sleepless guardian, feeling the weight of it all settle on your shoulders. The quiet is too complete. Sometimes you talk just to hear your own voice. You murmur to the fire like an old friend. You ask it to hold on. You promise it more wood if it just doesn't die. And then, morning, or what passes for morning in this grey skid season. The fire burns lower but steady. Your shift ends. You tuck in beside the others, grateful for the body heat, and drift into a shallow sleep that feels more like a pause than rest. Scholars debate how widespread fire shifts were in early frontier households. Some accounts suggest they were common practice, especially in the coldest regions, while others claim most people simply built massive fires and hoped for the best. But based on the sheer number of chimney fires and frostbite records in the 1800s, it's safe to say plenty of people didn't keep watch, and some didn't wake up. There's one quirky method you read about in an old journal, the ember jar, a small clay pot lined with ash meant to hold a live coal overnight. Tucked near the fire, it could be used to relight flames in the morning without flint or matches. It's clever. You make one yourself, shaping clay with frozen fingers, drying it near the fire for days. It cracks the first time you use it, but still holds a coal long enough to kindle a flame. You feel like a wizard. The longer the winter drags on, the more the night watch becomes part of your identity. You're no longer just someone trying to survive. You're the keeper of the flame, the sentinel. The last line between the living warmth of your cabin and the killing frost outside, and sure, you're exhausted. Your eyes are sunken, your muscles stiff, your thoughts slow. But when you sit in the glow of that fire, listening to the wind outside, watching the shadows dance, there's a strange sort of peace that settles in your chest. You're still here, still warm, still alive. You swore you'd never let it happen. You told yourself you'd draw the line somewhere. But here you are, staring across the dim, smoky room at a goat in your house, breathing your air, chewing hay like it owns the place. And next to it, a chicken, roosting comfortably on a chair you used to sit in. It clucks softly, then fluffs its feathers and drops something warm and wet onto the floorboards. You sigh. Welcome to the part of winter where you invite the animals inside, because it's them or the cold and you're starting to understand. Sometimes, survival means sharing your space with a small, judgmental barnyard. It starts with guilt. You hear them at night, your livestock, bleating, whining, rustling in the cold. The wind cuts through the thin walls of the shed like a blade. You tell yourself they'll be fine. You built that lean-to properly, didn't you? Then one morning you wake to find the smallest of your goats lying stiff in the snow, eyes wide open. And that's it. You can't take it. The next night you bring them in. At first, it's temporary, a crisis measure. Just until the storm passes, you carve out a little corner near the door, lay down straw, even set up a half-hearted barrier made from crates and broken furniture. The smell hits you immediately, warm, earthy, and distinctly barn-like. But so does the warmth, and suddenly you realise something important. Animals are heaters. Fluffy, hay-eating, occasionally annoying heaters. The goat stays, then the cow. The chickens, too. And somehow, the pig ends up waddling inside during a particularly nasty sleet storm. That one wasn't even your idea. The pig decided on its own, and who are you to argue with a 200-pound lump of warmth and attitude? You sleep wrapped in wool with a dog curled at your feet, chickens roosting above the hearth, and a cow snoring gently in the corner. It's chaos. It's crowded. It smells like something between a petting zoo and a campfire. But it's warm, and that's all that matters. Historically, this wasn't unusual. Many frontier families brought animals inside during the worst months. Not because they were sentimental, but because livestock was survival. Milk, meat, eggs. Losing one to cold was losing a food source. Some homes were built with cow sheds attached directly, sharing a wall with the main cabin to allow heat to transfer. Ingenious if you ignore the smell. A quirky fact from an 1830s farm journal tells of a family who swore their chickens laid more eggs when they were inside during winter. Maybe it was the warmth. Maybe it was the constant light from the hearth. Or maybe the chickens just liked the company. Either way, eggs are eggs, and in January, a fresh one is worth its weight in gold. At night, you lie in bed listening to the symphony of sounds. Snorts, clucks, gentle chewing, the occasional thud of a hoof against the floor. You learn to sleep through it. You even come to find it comforting. The animals are like an extra layer of protection against the howling wind outside. If they're breathing, if they're warm, if they're alive, then so are you. But let's be real, it's not glamorous. There's mud, there's droppings, there's the constant shuffle of animals trying to find a comfortable spot that doesn't involve stepping on your foot. You clean as best you can, but you're burning through straw faster than expected. You try laying down pine needles, sawdust, whatever you can find that absorbs the mess. It works for a while. Then the smell builds slowly, like a rising tide of ammonia and regret. You try to air things out during the warmest hour of the day, cracking the door just enough to let in some fresh air without losing all your heat. The chickens take this as a sign to escape. You chase them through snowdrifts, barefoot and furious, before giving up and dragging them back in one at a time like feathery criminals. One night, the cow sneezes directly into the fire. A blast of wet air sends a spray of ash across the room, and you just sit there, blinking, covered in soot. There's a moment of silence. Then the goat bleats, as if laughing, and yet it's hard not to get attached. You start naming them. You talk to them during your night shift. The pig stares at you like it knows your secrets. The dog becomes your shadow. The chickens, well, they still hate you. That's just chickens. Scholars have debated for years whether this practice, bringing animals inside, was a calculated survival technique or a last-ditch act of desperation. Some argue it was smart adaptation. Others say it showed just how unprepared settlers were for real winter. But you don't have time for theory. You have a chicken on your bed and a cow that's chewing the handle of your axe. This is your reality now. A few families even went further, building true dual-purpose structures, part stable, part home. The warmth from the animals was built right into the architecture. And yes, that came with risks. Parasites, disease, one wrong kick and your firewood pile turns into kindling for a barn fire. But it kept people alive. And in the depths of February, you start to understand that line between clever and crazy isn't as thick as you once thought. The psychological shift is real too. At first, sharing space with animals feels like failure. Like civilization has taken a step backward. But slowly something else settles in. A rhythm, a sense of life. The animals become part of your routine, your conversations, your ecosystem. You stop thinking of them as visitors and start thinking of them as roommates. Stubborn, messy, and occasionally loud ones. Then one morning you wake up and it's quiet. The snow has stopped. The sun is trying to peek over the horizon. You step outside just to see and realize something wonderful and slightly terrifying. The cold has broken. Just a little. But enough. You turn around to tell someone. Anyone, and realize the pig is now sitting in your chair, watching you. You sigh, you go back inside, and you let them stay just one more night. By now, the outside world is more theory than fact. You haven't seen open ground in weeks, just a solid sheet of white that stretches past the tree line and over the hills like the land's been erased. Your windows are sealed with frost, and when you open the door, it takes real effort, like pushing against the back of winter itself, so you don't go out unless you absolutely have to. And when you do, it's always the same desperate reason. Food. You're no longer cooking to impress anyone. You're not even cooking to enjoy it. You're cooking to not die. Every meal is an inventory check. You've counted everything 100 times. What's left of the cornmeal, the dried beans, that one sad sack of flour clinging to the last scoop. You've developed an eerie sixth sense for portion control. You can stretch a stew with just 2 potatoes and a lie. The root cellar is your reluctant treasure trove, cold, dark, and constantly smelling of damp earth and slow decay. Root cellars are a frontier staple, and now you understand why. Dug into hillsides or built beneath the cabin, they use the ground's natural insulation to keep things just above freezing. Cold enough to preserve, warm enough to keep from freezing solid. Yours is small, cramped, and lined with shelves stacked with jars and burlap sacks, some full, some disturbingly light. You descend the stairs like a miner, hoping the gold vein hasn't run out. Down there, time seems different. You run your fingers over dusty jars of pickled cabbage, beets, and the last few precious peaches preserved in syrup. A miracle from back in August, now transformed into something sacred. You ration them, a spoonful here, a slice there, A little reminder that once the sun existed. There's something that gets under your skin during these food runs, the constant awareness that everything is finite. Every time you open a jar, empty a sack, or finish off a loaf, the weight of it hits you. That was it. There's no more unless you make more. And winter doesn't care how good your intentions are. You become a food alchemist. You combine things that should never be combined. You mash turnips into mush and call it porridge. You boil old ham bones until the marrow drips out like glue and pretend it's soup. You throw dried beans and salt into a pot and let it bubble for hours until it becomes something thick and edible. If it sticks to the spoon and doesn't smell like defeat, it counts as dinner. A quirky recipe you try comes from a tattered frontier manual. Bread soup. You take stale bread, pour hot water over it, add a pinch of salt and stir until it stops looking sad. It tastes like wet disappointment, but it's warm, and that's what matters. Some settlers added wild herbs or dried berries if they had any. You once found a single shriveled blackberry in a jar and put it into a pot of rice. It dissolved on contact, but for a brief second, your stew was purple and smelled like hope. You start inventing names for things. Mystery stew. Last Tuesday's surprise. Maybe don't ask. It helps. It keeps the mood light when everyone's chewing something that may or may not have begun life as jerky. You learn that humour is a spice and so is lying. Then there are the moments when you have to dig deep. Literally. You haul up frozen carrots that have gone limp and translucent. You scrape mould off stored apples and cut around the rot. You find a sack of potatoes that smells just off enough to give you pause, and you eat them anyway, because hunger overrules hesitation. Historians still debate the true extent of food shortages on the frontier. Some claim most families had enough preserved to make it through. Others argue that lean winters were the norm, not the exception, and that hunger was a quiet, constant companion for months on end. Based on your current meals, you're leaning toward the latter. There's an old settler diary that tells of a man who once boiled leather to make shoe stew. He softened strips of rawhide in water until they were chewable. Claimed it worked as long as you didn't mind the taste of boot. You haven't gone that far. Yet. But you did find yourself staring at a dried-out squirrel hide once, wondering how bad things would have to get. And it's not just about the food you do have, it's the food you don't. Your cravings become cruel. One night, you dream of butter melting on fresh cornbread. Another, it's roasted chicken with salt, pepper and rosemary. You wake up to a half-burnt chunk of cornmeal mush and the sound of the pig snoring by the hearth. Some days the hunger makes you bold. You strap on snowshoes, awkward, homemade contraptions lashed with rawhide and stubbornness, and trek into the woods looking for anything edible. You dig through the snow to find frozen berries or strips of bark. You once boiled pine needles for tea. It tasted like Christmas and regret. Another time you thought you saw a rabbit trail, only to chase it into a drift and end up face down, snow in your collar holding a stick instead of dinner. You learn how much effort food actually takes, how long it takes to grind corn by hand, how annoying it is to hull beans one at a time. You learn patience, or at least a low-level food-fueled rage disguised as patience. And yet, every now and then you pull off a miracle. You boil beans and jerky, add just the right herbs, and it smells good. People gather around the pot like it's a sacred relic. You serve it in cracked bowls, and for 5 minutes everyone eats without speaking. The fire pops, someone sighs, the dog licks the floor, and for a moment it's enough. Frontier survival isn't just fire and walls, it's food, real food. Even if it's terrible. Even if it's scavenged or scraped or made from the leftover flour stuck to the bottom of the barrel. It's warmth from the inside out, and that warmth, however fleeting, keeps you going. So you scrape the pot, you lick the spoon, you store every crumb like it's currency, and when someone asks what's for breakfast tomorrow, you smile and say, let's find out together. Starts with a tingling, a numb spot on your fingertip that doesn't seem to come back to life. Even when you press it against a mug of steaming tea, you brush it off. Must have just slept on your hand wrong. Then it spreads, first your pinky, then your toes. The cold doesn't just bite anymore, it burrows, crawls in deep, sets up shop in your joints and dares you to kick it out. You've entered the part of winter where the real enemy isn't the snow or the hunger, or even the boredom. It's your own body, and what the cold plans to take from it. Frostbite isn't a dramatic thing at first, it's sneaky, quiet. You stop feeling your fingers while carrying water, and then you stop worrying that you can't feel them. You forget to wear mittens for just 5 minutes, and that's all it takes. When your hands finally warm up again, they throb with pain like they've been lit on fire. It's a cruel twist. Getting warm hurts more than being cold. You don't talk about it much. Nobody wants to admit it. But all of you are watching each other's ears, noses, toes, checking for that pale, waxy look, that quiet deadness. You hide it when you can. Tape your fingers, wear double socks, you wrap your feet in cloth at night and place them near the fire like damp kindling. But there's only so much you can do. The socks are a whole story unto themselves. You own maybe 3 pairs. One is always damp, one is slightly less damp. The other is the holy grail, almost dreary, almost warm, and therefore worn only on special days like Sunday, or when your toes are threatening to revolt. You dry them on a line above the fire, where they dangle like little wool flags of surrender. If you're not careful, they scorch. If you're really not careful, they catch fire. That's a fun way to explain to your housemates why their socks now resemble burnt pancakes. One quirky method you try, out of sheer desperation, involves putting warm ashes in a cloth bag and tucking it into your boots. The idea is that the ashes stay warm and dry your feet while providing a little insulation. It kind of works. It also kind of makes you feel like you're walking on a gritty, ashy mess, but you'll take that over frostbitten toes any day, and still, no matter what you try, your feet stay cold, always. Even in bed, even wrapped in wool and tucked near the fire, they ache like you've walked barefoot across a glacier. You get into a routine of rubbing them each night, muttering curses under your breath like some kind of frost-footed wizard. You don't even care who sees anymore. Then come the chilblains, those weird, itchy red patches that bloom across your hands and feet like angry frost flowers. You scratch until you bleed, then wrap them in cloth soaked in vinegar or pine tea or whatever remedy someone swears worked good for their cousin's uncle's friend. Nothing helps. You scratch, you bleed, you carry wood anyway. You remember reading once that Napoleon lost more men to cold than to combat during his Russian campaign. You think of that now, hauling water with fingers that feel like porcelain. You don't need a battlefield for frostbite, just an ungloved moment outside the cabin. There's one horrifying moment when you pull off a boot and notice your toe looks different, pale, shiny, like wax. You press it. It doesn't respond. Panic bubbles up, but you swallow it. You soak it in warm, not hot, water. That's the rule. Warm is safe, hot is dangerous. You feel the sensation crawl back slowly, like a beast waking from hibernation. It hurts so bad you almost seem to scream, but you don't. Because pain means it's still alive. Frostbite isn't the only thing you're dodging. There's hypothermia too. The slow, sneaky drop in body temp that makes people act strange. Confused, clumsy, sometimes even cheerful. That's the terrifying part. It can make you feel warm right before you freeze. You keep an eye on each other. If someone starts stripping off clothes or wandering outside in the snow without boots, that's the red flag. There's a story from a settler diary, maybe true, maybe exaggerated, about a man who got lost during a blizzard and was found the next morning sitting calmly under a tree, coat off, smiling, i.e. he was waiting for summer. You never forget that Vermont story. It becomes a warning. You remind yourself, real cold doesn't feel cold. Real cold feels like surrender. And sometimes your cabin isn't much better. The fire doesn't reach every corner. There are pockets of cold that seem to exist just to mock you. You move your bed closer to the hearth. You try to seal the cracks with more moss, more cloth, more whatever. Still, you wake up to frost on the inside of the walls, on the inside. That's when the fear really settles in. Not loud, not panicked, just a quiet dread in your gut. The realization that this winter doesn't want to be survived. It wants to take something. A finger, a toe, a foot. It doesn't care. It just wants less of you than there was before. And that makes you fight harder. You rotate your socks religiously. You never go outside without checking your gear twice. You drink warm tea even when it tastes like boiled tree bark. You share body heat when you need to, huddling under blankets, passing the dog around like a furry space heater. You build up the fire again and again like a dare to the cold. Scholars still argue about how much frostbite actually happened on the frontier. Medical records were scarce. People didn't always report it. Sometimes they just lived with the damage. Blackened toes, stiff fingers, limps that never went away. But you believe the worst stories now. You're living proof of how easy it is to fall behind on body maintenance when your whole life revolves around staying 1 inch ahead of freezing to death. And yet, somehow, you're still here. All 10 fingers, all 10 toes, they don't feel great. They barely feel at all. But they're still yours. And in a winter like this, that counts as victory. So you sit by the fire, you stretch your legs toward the heat. You check your toes again, just to be sure, and you promise yourself they can take your boots, they can take your socks, but they will not take your toes. By now, your eyes have adjusted to the dark like you're part bat, and you've grown familiar with the peculiar geometry of shadows cast by firelight and lanterns. Still, you can't help but notice something missing. Light. Real, honest-to-goodness daylight. Or more specifically, the windows that are supposed to bring it in. Because here's the thing no one tells you before you build a cabin on the frontier. Glass is a luxury, a really, really expensive one. And if you didn't bring panes with you from wherever you came, then congratulations. Your cabin doesn't have windows. It has holes. And holes don't belong in walls during the coldest winter in living memory. You think you can tough it out, maybe rig something with animal hide or thin paper, and sure, it'll keep the wind from slicing your face open. But don't kid yourself, it's not warm, it's not even close, and when the sun does show up for those brief, reluctant hours, it barely filters through your makeshift coverings. The cabin stays dim, murky, lit only by the fire, a few weak candles, and your growing disillusionment. You miss windows more than you thought you would. You miss looking outside without stepping outside. You miss knowing what time of day it is based on the slant of the light. Now, you gauge time by the fire's condition, the length of shadows on the floor, and how long your stomach's been growling. And let's be honest, your sense of time is an absolute mess. Even if you had glass windows, they wouldn't help much. Not out here, not in this hold. They'd frost over in minutes, and every breath inside would cling to them and freeze. There are accounts from settlers who describe the inside of their glass windows being so thick with frost they had to scrape them like wagon wheels every morning. Others avoided windows altogether, choosing smaller wall gaps with oil paper coverings, semi-translucent, waxed for water resistance, and almost entirely ineffective at insulation. You tried that. It didn't work. Now the opening is just boarded up with firewood scraps, and you pretend it was never meant to be a window at all. The trade-off is clear. Do you want a view or do you want to survive? You choose warmth, every time, which means your cabin feels more like a bunker than a home. When the door's shut and the fire's crackling, it's cozy, kind of. But in the middle of the day, with the sky an endless grey and the corners of your room thick with shadow, you start to feel it. The weight of all this darkness pressing in. It's a slow suffocation, not of breath, but of spirit. There's a phenomenon frontier folk used to whisper about, cabin fever, not the kind where you get a little restless. No, this is something more. A creeping anxiety, paranoia, despair. Too much time indoors, too much dark, too little contact with the outside world. Some said it made people turn strange. Some said it made people disappear. You laugh it off, at first. But when the days bleed into one another, and you haven't seen sunlight in what feels like weeks, you start to wonder. You try making light with what you have. Candles mostly. Tallow ones, rough and lumpy, made from animal fat and a prayer. They smoke like chimneys and smell like meat. But they do the job. Kinda. You place them on shelves, on tin plates, anywhere safe-ish. But they burn fast and you only have so many. You ration them like food. Light one when you need to see something. Extinguish it the moment you're done. The rhythm of life becomes strike, squint, snuff. A quirky fact you come across in a borrowed almanac. Some early settlers crafted grease lamps from hollowed stones or metal cups filled with rendered fat with a rag for a wick. You try it once. It works, technically. Also makes the cabin smell like someone deep-fried a raccoon. Still, you keep it around for emergencies. Ooh, it's funny. You never thought of light as a resource before. It just existed. Came with the morning. Left at night. Now it's something you guard, something you hoard, or you find yourself moving slower in the dark, bumping into walls, stepping on things, most recently, a chicken, and cursing like someone who has truly lost their patience with every stick of furniture in the room. Historians debate whether the lack of windows in frontier cabins was truly necessary or just poor planning. Some argue it was purely practical. Glass was too fragile and expensive, and wall openings meant drafts, which meant death. Others think it was psychological. A barrier. A sense of security from the endless wilderness just outside. You suspect it was both. After all, you've learned to dread what might be on the other side of the walls. Coyotes, wolves, worse, silence. You become hyper-aware of sound. In a windowless cabin, the creak of a log or the snap of a fire sounds louder, more immediate. When the wind howls, it fills the whole room. You start recognizing certain groans in the cabin walls. One sounds like a sigh. Another, like a footstep. You tell yourself it's just the wood settling. You tell yourself a lot of things. The darkness inside affects your mind too. Makes it harder to remember things. You forget what the day it is. You startle more easily. You lose track of where you put things. You've spent an entire hour looking for your mittens while wearing them. You laugh when it happens, not because it's funny, but because if you don't, you'll probably start crying instead. To fight the darkness, you rearrange the room. You try to reflect light, placing tin plates and metal scraps near the fire to bounce the glow around. It helps a little. You hang white cloth behind your candles. You polish lantern glass until it's clear as river water. You do everything except punch a hole in the wall and let the wind in, because that would undo everything. Sometimes you dream about windows, not just the glass kind, but big ones, with curtains, with sunlight streaming through in golden shafts, the kind you saw in books or maybe once in a town back east. You dream about sitting next to one, drinking something warm, watching birds flutter past and not worrying about your toes falling off. And then you wake up, light a tallow candle, and see your breath curling through the smoke like a warning. No windows here, just walls, just firelight, just you, but you're still alive, even in the dark. Sleep never comes easy in the cold, but at some point your body stops caring. Exhaustion wins. You curl under a pile of everything you own, blankets, coats, maybe the dog if it'll hold still, and drift off in spurts. And when you do sleep, it's heavy, like being buried alive in wool and smoke. But even then, the cold creeps in. You find your feet, your fingers, your fit, so you get clever, or, depending on your standards, you get desperate. Enter one of the oldest survival tricks in the snow-covered book, hot rocks. You've probably heard of it before. Heat up a few smooth stones in the fire, wrap them in something not flammable, ideally, and tuck them into your bed to fight off the freezing night. It sounds quaint, almost cozy, like something a storybook grandmother might do. But when you're the one hauling sizzling rocks out of the hearth with a pair of tongs made from broken fireplace tools, you quickly discover there's nothing elegant about it. It's practical, and also mildly terrifying. The rocks hiss when you place them on the floor, still glowing faintly orange around the edges. You wrap them in thick cloth, usually whatever's least smoky or soaked in goat hoof juice, then shove them under the quilt, carefully. One wrong move and you've got a scorched mattress, or worse, a brand new scar shaped like the side of a boulder, but done right. It's glorious, like climbing into a bed that already has a heartbeat. The heat radiates slowly, a kind of deep, steady warmth that wraps around your legs and says, just for tonight, you don't have to shiver. The fire may die down, but the rocks keep working long after you've drifted off. Of course, there are drawbacks. The heat doesn't last forever. After 2 or 3 hours, the rocks go cold and start leaching heat from you. So now you've got a decision to make. Stay put and deal with the chill, or crawl back out into the dark and reheat your primitive bedtime furnace. Usually the cold wins, you kick off the blankets, grumble, and start the whole clumsy process over again, trying not to step in anything left behind by the pig, who has decided your bed is the warmest spot in the house. There's an old settler trick you read about, heating a brick instead of a rock. Bricks apparently hold heat longer and more evenly. If you're fancy enough to own bricks, that is. You're not. You've got river stones, pulled from the creek bed back in October, and dried near the fire ever since. They're smooth, solid, and occasionally explode if you overheat them. Yes, that happens. Ask the small dent in the cabin wall. You also try heating water bottles. Of a sort. Metal flasks filled with hot liquid, sealed tight, wrapped in cloth, and placed at your feet. It works, to a point, but it's risky. If it leaks, you're sleeping in a puddle. And out here, sleeping in a puddle is just one step removed from, please take my toes, I wasn't using them anyway. The challenge with bed warming methods is that you're balancing warmth with safety, and both are constantly trying to sabotage each other. You want the rock hot enough to feel like a small sun, but not so hot that you wake up screaming. You want to place it close enough to radiate heat, but far enough to avoid a second-degree burn. And if you share a bed with someone, good luck. There's always that moment where someone rolls over onto the rock and makes a sound that is definitely not sleep-related. Still, you make it work, because it does work. And out here, function beats comfort every time. Some families took the hot rock idea further. They'd dig shallow pits near the hearth, line them with stones, heat them all day, and then move bedding over them at night. Instant floor heater. Others, particularly those with more resources, built masonry beds with compartments underneath to fill with embers. Basically the prototype for heated floors. Genius. Also completely out of your league. There's even one documented case, fringe but real, of a family using heated sand. They kept a metal tray by the fire, filled it with dry sand and warmed it throughout the day. At night, they'd pour the hot sand into cloth bags and sleep with them. You read about that and think clever. Also, where in this frozen forest are you going to find dry sand? You notice too that the dog gets it. You heat up a rock, place it at the foot of the bed, and next thing you know, the dog is curled around it like it's found the secret to eternal life. Smart mutt. You let it stay. The fire remains your main source of heat, of course, but it's not always enough. Not when the wind howls. The snow piles high and the frost creeps across the inside walls like some slow-moving glacier with a grudge. So you thank the rocks, you stack them near the fire during the day, rotating them like you're running a one-person pizza oven. You get good at testing their temperature with a fast tap of the palm, quick enough to avoid blisters, long enough to judge. Sometimes you wonder how people survived without these tricks. How many froze simply because no one told them a rock could be their best friend? And then you remember, they didn't all survive. That's the part the stories leave out. Not every settler made it. Some built fires too small, used wood too green, went to sleep thinking they'd wake up and didn't. That thought stays with you, especially on the nights when you lie in bed, your feet pressed against the last of the warmth, listening to the fire die down and the wind rise up again. You tighten the blankets, pull the dog closer, and rest your heel against the still warm stone wrapped in a torn old towel. You might not have windows, or fresh food, or dry socks, but you have this, a hot rock in a cold bed, and sometimes that's enough. Darkness doesn't just fall, it settles, thick and absolute, swallowing your cabin like ink in water. Once the sun's gone, and honestly, you're not even sure it showed up today, your whole world contracts to the circle of light cast by a flickering flame, and every night that circle gets smaller. Why? Because you're running out of candles, and that means you're running out of light. When the tallow's low, you feel it. Not in your stomach like hunger, but behind your eyes. You feel it when you squint at the floor, trying to find your boot in the gloom. Or when you bump into the stove and curse the fact that you can't afford to burn an extra wick. It's a new kind of rationing now, illumination. Your supply started out fine, candles you brought with you, tucked in boxes and tins, carefully wrapped in cloth to keep them from melting in the autumn sun. You even had the good kind at first, beeswax, if you can believe it. Smooth, golden, faintly sweet. They burned clean, no stink, no smoke. You guarded them like treasure. Then winter hit, and the good ones went fast. You tried to use them sparingly for reading, sewing, writing letters, but eventually all that was left was tallow. The poor man's candle. Tallow's made from animal fat, rendered down until it's thick and waxy, poured into moulds or hand-dipped onto wicks that barely hold shape. And it smells exactly like what it is. Cooked grease. Light one and your cabin fills with the scent of a butcher's apron. Not ideal, but out here, ideal's been dead since November. There's an entire ritual to making them. You melt the fat slowly, skimming off anything that looks suspicious. You strain it through cloth, try not to gag, and pour it into whatever's handy. Old tins, hollowed out bones, even shells if you're feeling rustic. Then you drop in a bit of twine or rag as a wick, let it cool, and hope it holds together long enough to burn for more than 10 minutes. If you're lucky, you've got a real wick. Cotton cord, tight and slow burning. If you're not, you improvise. One time you braided strands of your own shirt and dipped it in wax. It worked. Sort of. The flame danced like it was drunk and spat tallow all over the table. But it gave you 15 minutes of light, and that was a luxury. But the true test? Candle rations. You learn quickly that wasting tallow is right up there with wasting food. It burns too fast. If you leave one lit when you don't need it, while eating, walking, just thinking out loud, you're basically tossing part of your survival plan into the fire. So you stop lighting candles just because it's dark. Now you light one only when you have a reason, a real reason. Dinner? Maybe. Reading a note from home? Okay. Staring blankly at the wall while questioning your entire life path? Nope. Do that in the dark. Some frontier families didn't use candles at all. They relied on firelight alone, or grease lamps made from whatever scrap metal they could bend into shape. There's a quirky method in an old pioneer guide involving burning pine knots, which are rich in sap and flare brightly when lit. You tried it once. It smoked like a chimney and filled the room with the smell of a burning Christmas tree. But hey, it was bright. There's even a fringe theory that some families used ice windows, thin sheets of frozen water placed in frames to let in light during the day. Sounds wild, right? Probably apocryphal, but still, there's something poetic about using the very thing trying to kill you to see a little more clearly. The real problem comes when you need both hands, cooking, mending, anything involving tools. You need light, but you don't have lantern oil. You end up tying a candle to a stick, holding it in your mouth, or balancing it on a shelf while you work in the shadowy cone of flickering light. It's dangerous. You burn yourself. You singe your hair. One night, a candle tips onto your only decent pair of gloves, and you spend the rest of the week scraping hardened tallow off the fingers and muttering curses under your breath. Eventually your candles get shorter. You remelt the stubs, combining them into Franken candles with twisted wicks and lumpy sides. They burn crooked, but you learn to rotate them slowly, like roasting a marshmallow, so one side doesn't collapse before the other. You start scheduling your life around the light. Wake with the sun, or what passes for it. Do everything you can before dark, then retreat to the fire. You read less. You write even less than that. Not worth the candle. And the darkness, it grows. Not just in the room, but in your thoughts. Without light, the cabin feels smaller, the walls closer. You become aware of every creak, every sigh from the fire, every breath from the animals tucked in the corner. The shadows stretch long and whispery. They play tricks on your mind. You see things, or think you do. There's a moment late one night when you swear you see movement outside, just a flicker in the corner of your vision. You grab your coat, step outside with your one remaining candle, and hold it up like a talisman. The flame sputters in the wind, casting weird shapes on the snowbanks. There's nothing there, just the wind, just your nerves. You go back inside and let the candle burn to the base without even trying to snuff it. You needed it. Scholars often debate how psychologically damaging long winters were for frontier settlers. Some claim people adapted to darkness better back then, that they were used to early nights and long rests. Others suggest the lack of light led to spikes in depression, cabin fever, even hallucinations. And you know what? You don't need a debate. You're living the answer. Still, there's power in one little flame. Even now, even here. You strike the flint, catch the spark, and when that wick catches, the whole room feels just a little less heavy. The shadows lean back, the cold eases, and you can finally see your own hands again. You guard that flame like your life depends on it, because sometimes it does. Time doesn't move in days anymore. It moves in storms, in firewood loads, in how many candles you have left, in how many meals you can stretch from a single shriveled onion. And somewhere along the way, you stop noticing when the days get darker and start noticing when you do. You're different now, slower, more cautious, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit cracked. The truth is, you've been inside too long. The cabin has become your whole world. 10 steps in any direction and you're touching a wall. You can trace the shape of every knot in every log. You know exactly where the floor creaks when you step near the door. You can predict the rhythm of the fire before it flares. It's familiarity on the edge of obsession. You aren't just living in the cabin. You've merged with it. You are the cabin. But your mind is somewhere else entirely, floating, flickering, chewing on its own thoughts like a caged animal. The silence gets to you, especially at night when the fire dies down and even the wind seems too tired to howl. You think you hear things, scraping, whispering, soft thumps. Probably the animals, probably your imagination. But you get up to check anyway, every time. You talk to yourself more now, not full conversations, at least not yet, but murmured notes, muttered curses, little remarks no one else is supposed to hear. You tell the fire it's doing a good job. You scold the walls for letting in the draft. You say thank you when your boots thaw out by morning. You don't even notice you're doing it until someone catches you. And by someone, of course, you mean the pig, who gives you a look that says, "This is why I sleep in your chair." There's a term for it, winter madness. Or, if you're feeling dramatic, going squirrely. The condition where isolation, darkness, hunger and relentless cold start peeling away layers of sanity. It happened to mountain men, to Arctic explorers, to ordinary families who just couldn't take one more day of staring at the same four walls. There are accounts of people hallucinating, screaming at the wind, even abandoning their homes mid-blizzard because they thought they heard voices calling them outside. One story from a Montana settler in the 1870s tells of a man who insisted he saw people dancing in the snow every night. Neighbours found him barefoot in a drift, smiling, convinced he was at a party. He lost 3 toes, never talked about it again. You read that story once, thought it was ridiculous. Now you think it sounds plausible. You're not there yet, but you feel the slope under your feet. To fight back, you try structure. You make a schedule. Morning, firewood and water. Midday, cook something. Afternoon, mend something. Night, fire tending and pretending to read. It helps, a little. The illusion of control, but the days blur anyway. You find yourself staring at the same page in a book for an hour, reading the same sentence 3 times and still not remembering what it said. Sometimes you write things down, little notes to yourself, lists, observations, fragments of dreams, just not because you think they matter, but because it reminds you that you exist outside your own head. You read them later and they barely make sense. One note says, goats are better at stairs than they should be. Another just says, Thursday, with a question mark. You don't remember writing that one. The worst moments come when you try to sleep. That's when your mind decides to unravel like a dropped skein of yarn. You think about everything all at once. Home, people you miss, food you'll never eat again. The sound of rain instead of snow. You think about warm sand, green grass. Light through real glass windows. Your body shivers even though the bed is warm, and you realise it's not from the cold. Some days you don't want to get up. The fire's low, the cabin's dark. You lay there under the blankets and just listen to the creaks, to the wind, to the sound of your own heartbeat thudding against the silence. You tell yourself it's okay to rest, but really you're avoiding. Because once you're up, it's the same routine, the same food, the same 10 steps. And yet there are tricks, little things to hold on to. You clean, not because it needs it, but because it gives your hands something to do. You reorganize the shelves for the 10th time. You sharpen knives that haven't been used in a week. You mend clothes that aren't even torn. You braid strips of leftover cloth into ropes, just to see how long they'll get. You hum songs you don't remember learning. You hum until the sound fills the space enough that the quiet can't push back in. There's an old belief that whistling in the cabin at night invites spirits. You don't whistle, not because you believe it, but because, well, just in case. A quirky account from an 1830s diary describes one woman making dolls out of straw and moss to keep herself company during the winter. She gave them names, voices, and braided their hair. Her neighbours called her odd. But she survived 5 straight winters in a cabin smaller than yours. So maybe odd is a small price to pay. Scholars argue about how much of frontier madness was environmental versus psychological. Was it the cold, the lack of sunlight, the constant stress of survival? Or was it just the sheer loneliness? Being cut off from the world, from variety, from stimulation? They probably all played a part. But you don't need a theory. You can feel it in your bones. You've started counting how many logs it takes to boil a pot of water. You've memorised the knots in the floorboards. You can tell the time based on how loud the wind is. And sometimes when you wake up in the night, you forget where you are for a split second and you think, maybe this was a mistake, maybe all of it. But then morning comes, or what passes for it. You get up, you light the fire, you brew pine needle tea, you stretch your arms and shake the weird dreams out of your head. And you do it all again. You're not losing your mind, not completely, just brushing up against the edges. That's the winter. That's what it does. But the trick isn't in staying sane, it's in staying here, in holding on to yourself, even if it's by the threads of your mittens and the echo of your own voice in an empty room. So you take a deep breath, you whisper something to the fire, you remind yourself you're still real, and you keep going. Some nights, when the wind dies down and the cabin walls stop groaning, you reach for the bottle. Not proudly, not even intentionally at first. It's just there, tucked behind the flour sack or wedged under a bundle of rags. You tell yourself it's for emergencies, for disinfecting wounds, for bartering. But then comes a night so bitter, so bone-deep cold that logic steps aside and you say to yourself just a sip, for the heat. And in that moment, whiskey feels like mercy. The first swallow burns like fire. Good. That's the point. It spreads through your chest like a thaw, a false sun pushing warmth into the frozen edges of your body. For a few precious minutes, you almost feel human again. The cold steps back. Your muscles unclench. The world softens. The fire glows brighter. The shadows lean away. You might even smile, but it never lasts. What feels like heat is just a trick, a false signal from your blood vessels dilating. Your core temperature doesn't rise, it drops. Alcohol sends the warmth to your skin, not your organs. You're not heating up, you're hemorrhaging heat like a leaky stove. And by the time the buzz wears off, your fingers are colder than before, your breath comes in shallow bursts, and the cabin feels like it's 50 degrees colder than it was an hour ago. You know all this. You've heard the warnings, the stories. But knowing and caring are 2 different things when your whole body is stiff with cold and your firewood supply is down to kindling and prayer. So yeah, sometimes you drink and you're not alone. Plenty of frontier settlers turn to liquor during winter. Whiskey, brandy, cider, even straight grain alcohol mixed with whatever they could find. It was medicine, painkiller, numbing agent, and sometimes distraction. There are diaries from the 1800s that mention rum tea as a daily treat during blizzards. A dangerous treat. More than a few froze in their sleep with a half-empty bottle beside them. There's one grim tale, maybe true, maybe not, of a trapper who tried to warm himself during a storm by drinking a pint of whiskey and crawling into a snowdrift. His logic? The cold can't find me if I'm under it. They found him 3 days later, perfectly preserved, still clutching the bottle. It became a cautionary tale. You remember it every time you're tempted to take another sip. Even with restraint, the whiskey changes your nights, makes your thoughts swim, makes the shadows ripple. One time you swear you saw someone sitting by the hearth across from you. Just for a second. Trick of the light, maybe. Or maybe it was the way the whiskey made the fire dance. Made your eyes blur, made your brain fill in shapes that weren't there. The line between comfort and danger is paper thin in the cold. Alcohol pushes you closer to the edge, but sometimes that edge looks like relief. You sit there, bottle in hand, staring into the fire, and remembering warmer places, brighter faces, home, childhood, meals with music in the background. You know it's a trap, but for one night you let yourself sink into it. Then there's the guilt. You wake up the next morning groggy, irritable, drier than sand. The fire has died down. The cabin is freezing. You wasted precious fuel while sleeping too deeply, lulled by the false heat in your blood. Your mouth tastes like ashes. You curse yourself quietly, while stirring the fire back to life and boiling water to chase away the hangover. You swear off the bottle. Again. You become more careful with it after that. You measure sips. You wait until the fire is strong. You drink only when you know someone else will tend the flames, or more often not at all. But the knowledge that it's there, just a few steps away, nags at you. Not because you crave it, but because you know how easily a single hard night can push you back to it. Scholars still argue about the cultural role of alcohol on the frontier. Was it a coping tool, a sign of desperation, a social lubricant? The truth is, it was all of those things, and more. In isolation, it was a shortcut to comfort. A way to momentarily escape the unrelenting grind of snow and silence. But the price was steep, and not everyone made it back from that escape. There's a strange comfort in that first burn, though. You can't deny it. That sip of warmth in a world of cold. That temporary illusion of control, of power over something. For just a moment, you feel like you're choosing to survive, not being dragged through it by your fingernails. You try replacing it with rituals, a cup of hot tea, a song hummed low, a page from a book, something that grounds you. Something that doesn't rob you of your senses. You build new habits, you save the bottle for actual emergencies, injuries, shock or trade, and you keep your distance mostly. One night you pour the last of the whiskey into a tin cup, warm it gently near the fire, and raise it in a quiet toast, to your fire, to your frostbitten boots, to the chicken who finally laid an egg after 3 weeks of dramatic sulking. You sip slowly, just one mouthful, you savour it. You let the heat bloom, then vanish. And when the cup is empty, you set it down and go to bed stone cold sober. Because the truth is, warmth doesn't come from the bottle, it comes from the fight. From getting up in the middle of the night to add one more log to the fire. From wrapping your fingers around a hot rock. From moving, even when you don't want to. It comes from choosing again and again to stay in your own mind even when the dark wants to take it. And in the end, that's stronger than whiskey. It's midwinter. And every meal now feels like a science experiment held together by desperation and blind culinary optimism. You're not cooking anymore. You're performing frontier food alchemy. You stir pots like a wizard with a limited spellbook and questionable ingredients. What you've got left in the cabin could barely stock a snack table, and yet you manage, every day, to conjure up something vaguely edible and miraculously just shy of poisonous. The pantry, such as it is, looks like the saddest general store in the history of sadness. A half sack of flour that smells a little musty but hasn't grown legs yet. A few jars of pickled whatever, you've stopped asking what. Beans, so many beans, dried, soaked, mashed, and reimagined in more forms than you care to admit. There's still some salt, thank God, and a handful of herbs you gathered months ago, now crumbly and flavourless but good for the illusion of variety. Your cooking style now consists of 3 main categories: stew, thicker stew, and bread-like substance. Every dish begins the same way. Water, heat, hope. You throw in beans. Maybe a sliver of dried meat if you're feeling rich. Some onions if you still have them, though by now they've gone soft and suspiciously sweet. You boil until everything softens into a single, lumpy consistency. Then you name it something whimsical, hunter's luck, wagon wheel delight, or your personal favourite. Mystery number 7. That last one was mostly turnip water and crushed acorn flour, but for 5 minutes, it actually tasted like something real. You learn to appreciate texture over taste. A little chew is a victory. A crunch that isn't from a beetle? Luxury. One night you find a whole clove of garlic hiding in your stash like a secret gift from the universe. You nearly cry. You use it sparingly, shaving bits into 3 different meals like kesim. It's the holy grail of flavourdom. Garlic becomes your new currency. There's a joy, strange but real, in taking garbage ingredients and making something borderline delightful. You start roasting things just to see what happens. You dry carrot peels and turn them into snacks. You even figure out how to make something sort of like a cracker, which is to say you bake mush until it's hard and flat. Does it taste good? Absolutely not, but it's crunchy and that's something. Preserved meat features prominently in the menu, and preserved covers a wide spectrum. Some is salted beyond recognition, basically edible leather. Others are stoked jerky, tough and chewy, and surprisingly satisfying after enough gnawing. The worst piece you ever ate had to be soaked in water for 2 hours before it stopped tasting like a barrel. You still ate it. You still called it dinner. And let's not forget the magical moments where you discover an ingredient you forgot you had. Like the time you pulled out a jar from the back of the shelf thinking it was pickles, and discovered molasses. Thick, dark, glorious molasses. You added a spoonful to your cornbread that night and it tasted like dessert. Real dessert. You nearly offered some to the pig in celebration and then thought better of it. That pig's already smug enough. But not everything's a success. Some meals are disasters. One time you added dried dandelion leaves to a stew and everyone in the cabin refused to eat for a full day. Another time you tried to make coffee out of roasted chicory root and ground acorns. It tasted like burnt tree bark steeped in disappointment. You still drank it. Twice. There's an old recipe passed down from settler to settler called slump. It's exactly what it sounds like. Stew with lumps of dough dropped in and boiled until they stop floating. It looks like sadness. And tastes like regret. But it fills you up. And that's all anyone can ask of a meal in January. You've made slump more times than you care to admit. And at this point, you've accepted it as a member of the family. A fringe fact you read once in a survival manual. Some pioneers made candy from boiled snow and maple syrup, letting it harden on a pan until it cracked like glass. It sounds mythical, something from a children's book. And then, one glorious day, you remember that you still have a tiny jar of syrup left from fall. You boil it, you drizzle it on fresh snow, and there it is. Candy. Real candy. Sweet and crisp and shockingly good. For a few minutes, it's like being alive again. But then the snow melts in your hand, the fire smokes too much, and you're back to scraping the pot with a stick. Scholars still debate just how inventive frontier families got with food during winter. Some argue that their survival was due to strict rationing and basic meals, just beans and bread day in and day out. Others point to the journals and oral traditions that talk about food creativity born from necessity. You fall firmly into the second camp. No one makes it through a frontier winter without getting weird in the kitchen. You make broths from bones, you bake ashes into biscuits, you steal a chicken egg once a week and divide it 4 ways. You once used pine needles in a stew and told everyone it was herbed. They believed you. Your relationship with food changes, becomes sacred. Not the food itself, really, but the act of making it. Stirring the pot, smelling the steam, watching it bubble, even if it's the same thing you had yesterday and the day before. The ritual becomes a tether to sanity, to routine, to the version of yourself that believes deep down you'll get through this. And when you serve the meal, no matter how ugly, bland, or questionably textured, you do it with pride. Because it means you found a way, one more time, to feed yourself and anyone stuck in this wooden box with you. That's not just food, that's survival with seasoning. So you wash the bowls, you scrape the pot clean, you tuck the last chunk of cornbread into a rag and save it for morning. You sit near the fire, stomach half full, and listen to the wind outside. Tomorrow, you'll dig through the pantry again. You'll boil something weird. You'll invent a name for it. And you'll eat like you mean it. Because food, out here, is hope you can chew. You've gotten used to a lot out here. The cold, the dark, the never-ending stew rotations. But one thing you'll never quite get used to is the dread of needing to pee at 2 in the morning. Because on the frontier, bathroom means one thing, the outhouse. And the outhouse in the middle of winter is less of a convenience and more of a horror film set. When nature calls, you have 2 choices: answer it, or lie awake for the next 5 hours with your bladder screaming and your dignity in shambles. Most nights you try to wait. But some nights you just can't. The outhouse is maybe 50 steps from the cabin, give or take. Far enough to be a journey, close enough to feel like a cruel joke. In the summer it's fine, smells weird but it's manageable. In the winter, it's a portal to a frozen underworld. You bundle up, brace yourself and step into the night, boots crunching over hard-packed snow, every muscle in your body clenching tighter with each breath of bitter air. Sometimes the moon helps, casting everything in ghostlight, at least giving you enough vision to avoid tripping over the woodpile or stepping into a snowdrift. Other times it's pitch black and you're navigating by memory, instinct and the occasional curse. You carry a lantern when you can spare the oil. When you can't, you stumble through the dark like a half-frozen raccoon on a mission. By the time you reach the door of the outhouse, your teeth are chattering and your hands have lost feeling. You push open the frozen plank, step inside and are immediately greeted by a smell that even the dead of winter can't entirely kill. It's not as bad as summer, but it's there. Earthy, sharp, and somehow still warm in a place where nothing else is. You lower yourself carefully onto a frozen wooden seat, try to finish your business without touching anything, and mentally prepare for the sprint back to the cabin. But then there's a sound, a low rustle, maybe a creak. You freeze, half out of fear, half because your muscles have stopped cooperating. You hold your breath and listen. Could be wind, could be snow sliding off the roof, could also be something alive, something with fur and teeth and not nearly enough respect for personal space. You've heard the stories, bears poking around in the fall, desperate for food, coyotes skulking through the woods at night, sniffing around for scraps, mountain lions, wolves, weasels with attitude problems, all possibilities. There's even a local legend about a raccoon the size of a dog that lives near the creek and steals boots. You laugh about it sometimes, but not out here. Not now. You hurry. You run back to the cabin with one boot half on and the other flapping. The door sticks. The lantern falls. You fumble with frozen fingers, yank it open, and slam it shut behind you, chest heaving, breath forming clouds as you curse the existence of every animal larger than a squirrel. The worst part, that wasn't even the scariest night. That came a few weeks back, when you opened the door and found fresh tracks in the snow. Big ones, padded, not human. You followed them with your eyes as they led around the cabin, up to the shed and vanished behind a snowbank. No sign of struggle, no blood, no mess. Just prints, like something had been watching, listening, maybe waiting. You're not the only one to experience it. A diary entry from an 1842 homesteader describes waking to find her milk goat dead outside the outhouse, throat torn open, snow around it black with blood. No explanation, just fear. She wrote that her children refused to use the latrine alone after that. You understand them perfectly. You try to get clever, digging out a night bucket and stashing it inside the cabin. Works fine for number 1. Number 2, not so much. And once the bucket freezes solid, you're back to braving the elements anyway. You build a small windbreak, add extra boards to the outhouse wall, even try insulating it with straw. It helps, but not enough. There's no such thing as a warm outhouse, only less terrible ones. And of course, the animals don't help. The goat once followed you out in the dark and bleated so loudly you nearly wet yourself before you even made it to the seat. The pig tried to wedge inside once, God knows why. Curiosity maybe, or the warmth. Chickens have taken to roosting on the path and you've stepped on more feathers, in the dark than you care to count. A fringe frontier trick you try, one you didn't believe until you were desperate, involves heating a flat rock near the fire and placing it on the outhouse seat. Sounds ridiculous, right? Until you try sitting on bare wood in sub-zero temperatures. That trick feels like the difference between survival and psychological collapse. You wonder how others did it. Indigenous communities had smarter systems. Warm pits, efficient shelters, not a box in the woods you have to sprint to like a terrified lunatic. You read once about trench latrines dug right outside the cabin for winter use, easier access, if not exactly dignified. You consider it. Then remember the smell in July and think better of it. But the fear? That sticks around. Every time you step outside after midnight, you brace for it. A growl, a flash of movement, a set of glowing eyes just beyond the lantern's reach. Most nights it's nothing, just wind, just snow, just your own paranoia feeding itself in the dark. But some nights something is out there. Something real, something watching, you can't prove it, but you know it, in your bones, so you go faster. You keep a knife by the door, you teach yourself how to hold the lantern in your teeth while your hands are full, you prepare. Because out here, something as basic as going to the bathroom has consequences. You used to laugh about frontier life. Roughing it, you called it. Now you understand. There's no roughing it out here. There's just surviving it. One trip to the outhouse at a time, you've stopped caring about gold. Not that you had much to begin with, but whatever sparkle the idea of wealth once held has long since dulled under layers of frost and the stench of wet wool. Out here in the deep marrow of winter, warmth is the only currency that matters. And there's one item that outvalues everything else: fur. Thick, rugged, animal-wearable fur. Forget shiny rocks or fancy paper money. If you want to survive a frontier winter, you better have something warm to wrap yourself in, or something worth trading for it. Your first brush with the frontier fur economy probably came long before you needed it. Maybe you saw someone in town with a coat that looked like it came off a bear still half awake. Maybe a trapper passing through tossed a bundle of pelts onto a counter and walked out with half the general store. Back then it seemed strange. Now it makes perfect sense. Fur means heat, it means comfort, it means not dying, which makes it the most valuable thing you can carry once the snow starts piling against the cabin walls and your fingers start turning an unsettling shade of white. You remember your first trade for fur like it was yesterday. You were low on mittens. The last pair got too close to the fire and went up in a puff of smoke and bad words. You had nothing else that would keep your hands from freezing off on wood chopping duty. So you hiked out to a neighbouring cabin, a trapper's shack that looked more animal than man, and you bartered. Gave him the last of your flour and half a bottle of cider. In return, you got a pair of beaver fur mittens that smelled like swamp and blood but felt like heaven. They're still the warmest things you own. Frontier bartering systems weren't polite, they were primal. Everything was a negotiation, and everyone knew exactly what their goods were worth, especially in winter. You could trade a rifle for a bearskin, a warm coat for a sack of salt. A single muskrat pelt might buy you a week of firewood depending on how desperate someone was, and desperation was the rule, not the exception. There's a strange economics to it. The colder it gets, the more value fur seems to gain. You'd laugh if it weren't so true. Trappers understood this. They built their entire livelihood on fur, hauling in pelts by the armload, drying them in sheds, stacking them like lumber. Otter, beaver, fox, mink, even bustard skunk. Though that last one came with its own brand of social consequences. One fringe report from an 1849 trading post describes a man who walked into a deal wearing nothing but a muskrat cape, a raccoon hat, and a necklace made of squirrel tails. He looked like a failed forest wizard. But he walked out with enough sugar, flour and molasses to last a month. Because function beats fashion every single time, there's also a certain hierarchy of furs. Beaver's prized for its density and waterproof quality. Muskrat's good for lining boots. Rabbit's soft but fragile, it works better in layers. Deer hides are useful for outer garments, tough and rugged, but they don't insulate as well. Then there's buffalo, if you're lucky enough to have one. Wrap yourself in a buffalo robe, and you'll sleep through the worst blizzard nature can throw at you, snoring like it's summer. If you don't trap yourself, you trade. And if you do trap, then your entire world revolves around checking lines, keeping furs dry, and hoping something hasn't chewed off its own leg to escape before you get there. It's grim sometimes, but it's life. You tried trapping once, didn't go well. You baited a snare near the edge of the woods, proud of your knots smug with anticipation. Came back 2 days later to find the trap empty and your bait gone. Next time you caught a rabbit, but the trap hadn't killed it, and the thing stared at you with such fury that you let it go out of sheer guilt. After that, you stuck to trading. Fur also plays a psychological role. It feels safer. A fur collar pulled up against your ears is more than insulation. It's armour. It's reassurance. It's the difference between walking into a storm and curling up like a scared animal inside a hollow log. When you wear fur, you don't just survive, you stand up to the cold like an equal. Of course, wearing fur means you look like a walking taxidermy exhibit. You've got patches stitched onto patches, a beaver hat with fox ear flaps, mittens lined with who knows what, a scarf that might actually be a ferret. You don't ask questions anymore, you just wear whatever works. Even if it smells like damp dog and has a tendency to shed into your soup, there's a practicality to all of it. You keep pelts hung near the fire to soften them. You brush out the fur with pine twigs. You learn how to sew rough hide with sinew and broken needles. You figure out what goes where: thicker hides for blankets, thinner ones for linings, soft fur for insoles. You adapt. And when the traders do come through, wandering the winter roads with sleds piled high and eyes that look like they haven't blinked since November, you trade again. You swap firewood, preserved food, or anything that hasn't frozen solid for a new pelt, a better lining, or a scrap big enough to patch the hole in your coat where the wind keeps finding your ribs. You stop thinking in dollars. You think in warmth units. Is this item worth 1 rabbit skin or 3? Would I give up my foxtail for that fur-lined cap? What's a dry, smoke-cured deer hide worth when you haven't had dry boots in 3 weeks? The answer? Everything. And still there's one trade you'll never forget. A boy no more than 12 shows up with a bundle of pelts wrapped in oilskin. Quiet kid. Eyes like polished stone. He lays out 5 perfect fox hides. Deep red, thick, beautiful. He points to your stew pot. You hesitate, then hand him the whole thing, full and steaming. He leaves without a word. You never see him again. But that night, you sleep with a fox pelt wrapped around your shoulders and your stomach full. In spring, maybe fur will go back to being something fancy. A fashion statement. A symbol of wealth. But in winter, it's a matter of life and death. And out here, death has cold fingers and no patience. So you keep trading, keep sewing, keep wrapping yourself in warmth that once had a heartbeat. Because gold can't keep you warm, but fur? Fur just might. Snow doesn't care if you're at war. That's the first thing you learn when conflict meets winter. The cold doesn't pause for enemies. It doesn't retreat for strategy. It just keeps falling. White, endless, and indifferent to whose side you're on. But out here on the frontier, sometimes war shows up anyway. Right when the temperature dips low enough to freeze the words in your mouth before they even leave your lips, it starts with rumours. A rider comes through, pale with frostbite and panic, muttering about a raid downriver. A settler family burned out in the night. Another farm abandoned. Then a skirmish, 2 men shot, 3 horses taken, tracks vanishing into the trees, and just like that, you realise that your little snow-covered cabin isn't as far off the map as you thought. There's no time to process it. You've already been fighting to stay alive in the cold. Now you have to think about weapons, about defence, about enemies who can navigate the snow better than you, who know the land better than you, who don't need a fire to survive the night. You start sleeping lighter. You sharpen tools that were meant for hunting but now feel like they're meant for something else. You move firewood inside, not just to stay warm but to block the door. Every creak of the log, every gust of wind scraping the shutters feels loaded, like it might be footsteps, might be breathing, might be more than just the wind. Historically, winter campaigns were rare but brutal. The weather did the killing as often as any bullet. A famous Revolutionary War journal tells of soldiers with feet wrapped in rags, no shoes, trudging through snowdrifts just to attack an enemy who was just as frozen and twice as miserable. No one won, they just endured. The frontier had its own conflicts, settlers clashing with local tribes, militia patrols gone rogue, raids carried out under the cover of snow and silence. You read accounts of native warriors travelling across frozen rivers in absolute silence, their footprints erased by falling snow before anyone could track them. Guerrilla tactics, precision, speed. Or while your kind is just trying not to die of exposure, you're not built for this. You were already hanging on by your fingernails. And now you've got to keep one eye on the horizon and the other on the door. You keep your gun closer now. You load it every night, clean it by firelight, double-check the powder, even though the cold makes the flint less reliable, and your hand's too stiff to aim right. You set trip lines with empty tins strung to string. You train the dog to bark at shadows, and you're not sure if that's a real skill or just paranoia dressed up in fur. One night you hear something outside, not wind, not snow. Something heavier, a crunch, then another. You reach for your weapon. Wait. Hold your breath, the fire crackles behind you. You wait longer than any human should be able to wait. Then, nothing. You open the door a crack. Just the trees, breathing in the dark. Maybe a deer, maybe not. You go back inside and stack another log against the door anyway. There's a moment in every frontier winter when you realise the weather isn't the only thing that can kill you. And unlike the snow, the enemy has intent, a plan, fingers that can strike a match and set a barn on fire. Or worse, take what little you have, what you spent months hoarding and rationing and protecting. You can survive the elements. You might not survive your neighbours. A story from 1863 haunts you. A settler family near the Missouri border. Winter raid. Cabin torched. No survivors, no one even knows which side did it. Partisan militias, revenge-minded settlers, desperate bandits. In the cold, the lines between friend and enemy get blurry, and the snow buries all the evidence. And if it's not humans, it's the threat of being caught between them. A troop of soldiers riding through, confiscating supplies, a wandering band of deserters who don't knock. You're isolated, vulnerable. You don't have the luxury of politics or flags. You only have one loyalty: survival. You start hiding things just in case. Bag of flour under the floorboards, dried meat tucked behind the chimney stone. A second knife wrapped in cloth and buried in the woodpile. It feels paranoid, until it doesn't. The dog growls more now, a low, uncertain sound, like it knows the air has shifted. You think about leaving, maybe packing what little you can and heading for the nearest outpost, but it's 4 days through deep snow with a half-dead horse and not enough rations. You would be a walking target, or a frozen one. So you stay, you hunker down, you outlast whatever's coming. A quirky footnote in an old militia report describes one settler woman who outsmarted a raiding party by nailing her front door shut, lighting fires in multiple rooms, and hanging a dummy in the window to make it look like her husband was standing guard. They passed her cabin by. You smile at that one. Might try it yourself. There's an old coat and a spare hat. Could work. Scholars argue about how widespread winter violence really was. Some say it was rare. Winter kept most conflicts at bay. Others claim it was the perfect time for an ambush. No crops to tend, no one expecting danger, everyone huddled inside like prey. You're starting to lean toward the second theory, because when the knock finally comes, soft, deliberate, and absolutely not the wind, you feel it in your spine. You don't answer right away. You wait, hand on the door, breath held, listening. Another knock, slower, heavier. You take the gun, crack the door just enough to see a man stands there, wrapped in a fur coat too fine to be local, holding nothing in his hands but the air around them is full of tension. He says one word, trade? You stare at him. You look at his eyes, not pleading, calculating. You don't answer. You shut the door and slide another log into place. Because out here, in the middle of a winter war that no one talks about, the only rule that matters is this. Trust is for spring, it starts with the smell. A strange sharp scent. Unfamiliar but unmistakable. Burnt pine maybe. Or singed dust. You ignore it at first because everything smells like something burned in winter. Socks, stew, your own nerves. But then it shifts, grows sharper. The kind of smell that makes your chest tighten. That makes you drop the spoon, forget the conversation, stand up without thinking. Something is wrong. The fire is crackling a little too loud. There's a pop, sharp and dry, followed by a flicker in the corner of your vision that isn't just firelight dancing. You whip around just in time to see it. A board near the hearth, too close for too long. A spark must have leapt, caught on a loose thread or a dry strip of kindling that you swore was out of reach. But it's burning now. Bright. Fast. Too fast. You don't think. You move. A wet blanket, a bucket of water from the melted snow barrel. Your own gloved hands, if that's all you've got. You slam it down, smother the flames, choke on the smoke, feel the heat bite through your sleeves like teeth. For a few frantic seconds, it's chaos. Coughing, shoving, cursing, praying, and then silence. The fire is out. But it could have been worse. It almost was. That's how it happens. That's how you lose everything. Because frontier cabins, they are made of wood, dry wood, exposed beams, packed kindling walls, roofs that creak and groan with tar and bark and thatch. Everything around you is basically tinder just waiting for an excuse. And the fire you depend on for survival, it doesn't care. It'll turn on you in a second. You become paranoid after that. Rightfully so. Every ember feels suspicious. Every snap of the fire sounds like a warning. You double-check the hearth before sleeping, again when you wake, and at least 4 times before stepping outside. You build a stone buffer around it, reset the logs farther in, hang a piece of sheet metal behind the wall to reflect the heat away from the timber. It helps, maybe, but still, there's no safety when your entire home could ignite in the time it takes to blink. Historical records are full of cabin fires. Most of them start the same way. Poorly built chimneys, overloaded hearths, candles tipped too close to drapes or pelts. One fringe tale tells of a man who built his fire inside a hollowed log to trap the heat. What it trapped instead was him. No one found the cabin until spring. You think of that story every time you catch a whiff of something unfamiliar. There's a terrifying fragility to your world now. The cabin feels strong in a storm, heavy with snow on the roof. It groans like a ship in the wind, but it holds. And yet, one stray spark could turn it into a torch. In less than a minute you'd have nothing. No shelter, no food, no tools, just the clothes on your back and the sound of flame chewing through your life. You make plans, just in case: a go bag by the door, blankets, dried meat, a flint striker and a knife, a pouch of herbs you don't even like but might need to chew if your throat tightens from smoke. You stash things in the shed: a shovel, a change of socks, a pot. You rehearse the escape in your mind, which way to run, where the snow's lowest, how long it would take to dig a hole and survive the night outside, because yes, you've considered it. If the cabin burns, you won't die in the fire. You'll die in the cold. Hypothermia will do its work faster than flames ever could. Your shelter isn't just a home, it's a suit of armour. One that's always slightly damp, full of fleas, and creaks when you roll over, but armour nonetheless. You start looking at everything differently. Firewood isn't just fuel, it's threat. Kindling gets locked in a metal box, ashes are scooped every morning and carried outside. Because you read about someone whose house went up, because the wind blew hot ashes out of a bucket they thought was cool. You build fire breaks, you stamp out even the coals that fall to the floor like glowing crumbs, and you talk about it. To yourself, to the animals, to the empty air. You repeat the rules like prayers. Bank the fire low at night, keep the bucket full, never sleep with a candle burning. These are the mantras now, not because you're scared, though you are, but because repetition might keep you alive. It happens again a few weeks later, not a fire, but close. A lantern tips while you're cleaning the chimney. The oil sloshes, the flame flickers too high, and you barely catch it before it licks the edge of the table. You yank it away, hands shaking. After that, you stop using lanterns unless absolutely necessary. Back to candles, short ones, in bowls of water. You even stop reading after dark. Some historians argue that fire was a settler's greatest asset. A miracle in the box. Others call it the devil's pet. The price paid for warmth in a world that wanted you dead. You're caught between both. You depend on it. You fear it. It's your best friend and your worst enemy. There's a reason indigenous winter shelters often use central fires with earthen or stone bases. Low smoke, better heat control, smarter, safer. You wish you had that knowledge. You wish you could tear down your chimney and rebuild it better. But now isn't the time for renovations. Now's the time for constant vigilance. Still, the fear doesn't paralyze you. It sharpens you. You treat fire with the reverence it deserves. You whisper to it sometimes, not out of superstition, but habit. Stay in the hearth. Do your job. You praise it when it behaves. You scold it when it spits. You hold it like a fragile animal, one that could warm you or kill you, depending on how well you fed it. And on the coldest nights, when the fire is burning just right, the shadows playing gently on the walls, the stew bubbling faintly in its iron pot, you let yourself relax. Just a little. You tuck your feet under a blanket, sip something warm, let your eyes close, but the fire never leaves your mind. Not really. You sleep with one ear tuned to the crackle, because you know that fire isn't just a source of life. It's a predator you've invited into your home. You wouldn't have made it this far without her. That's just the truth of it. Through snowstorms, lean weeks, dead fires, sick animals, broken tools, and nights so dark and long they feel like a punishment, you're here, in part because she kept it all from falling apart. She meaning the woman in the cabin. Maybe she's your wife, your mother, your sister. Maybe she's just someone who came west with the same stubborn streak you carry in your blood. Whoever she is she's the backbone of the entire operation, and somehow she's still standing. Frontier winters are hard on everyone, but they ask something different of women. It's not just the physical toll. Though let's not pretend she's not chopping, hauling, fixing, mending, skinning and feeding like any man with an axe and a frostbitten back. It's the constant toll, the unbroken weight of caretaking, planning, nursing, feeding, watching and waiting, of stitching up wounds, inside and out, of keeping a family and a fire alive at the same time. The first thing she does in the morning is get to work, not that she ever really stopped. Even at night, she's sleeping in shifts, keeping an ear out for the fire dying or the baby crying or the wind changing, or you getting up to battle the outhouse with a lantern and a muttered curse. If the fire's out, she lights it. If someone's sick, she makes tea. If the stew needs stretching, she adds more water and somehow makes it taste better than the night before. You've watched her do impossible math with ingredients that don't add up. 1 onion, half a carrot, a handful of salt, and she produces a meal that fills your belly and settles your bones. She doesn't complain. She can't complain, because if she slows down, everyone else falls apart. There's a quiet toughness in the way she moves. No dramatics, no declarations of strength, just motion. Action. A rhythm of survival so ingrained it almost looks effortless, until you try to step in for a day and realise just how much you've taken for granted. One night your youngest comes down with a fever. High, hot, frightening. You panic. She doesn't. She dampens cloths, stokes the fire, measures doses of willow bark and pine tea with the precision of a doctor. She holds the child's head through the worst of the shakes, murmurs old lullabies like armour, and doesn't sleep for 2 days straight. And when the fever breaks, she still cooks breakfast. You don't say thank you. Not right away, maybe not ever, the way she deserves. Because out here, thanks are spoken in actions, in chopping extra wood so she doesn't have to, in sewing a patch where the cabin draft hits her side of the bed, in fixing the door that always sticks. You don't need to tell her she's saving your lives, she knows. Historically, women on the frontier did everything, inside the home and often outside it. They were midwives, hunters, herbalists, butchers, teachers and trail scouts. Some delivered babies in snowstorms. Others buried husbands and raised 5 kids alone through winters that would make your bones whimper. And the records? They barely mention them. A line here, a footnote there. But behind every named settler, there's almost always an unnamed woman who kept him alive. There's a fringe tale from a Wisconsin homestead. 1871. Young woman, newly married. Husband goes out hunting. Never returns. She survives the rest of the winter alone, keeps the livestock from freezing, traps rabbits, barters her last 3 potatoes for firewood. When spring comes, the neighbours find her chopping wood in a coat, stitched together from 3 quilts, and what was probably her wedding dress. She offers them soup, smiles like nothing happened. The strength you see in the women out here, it's quiet. That's the part people miss. It's not showy, it's not loud. It's in the way she knits by firelight with hands cracked from hauling water all day. In the way she soaks her own socks in warm water so the kids can have dry ones. In the way she doesn't flinch when a storm slams into the roof. She just checks the buckets, seals the cracks, adds more stew to the pot. And she endures the cold in her own way. With layers, of course, but also with grit. There's something brutal and beautiful about the way she shrugs into a coat with a broken toggle, ties it with string and steps outside into the wind to haul snow like she's got something to prove to the blizzard. But winter's not just hard on the body, it wears down the soul too, and that's where you see her struggle the most. The endless grey sky, the isolation, the sameness of every day. It presses on her just like it presses on you, but she keeps going, not because she doesn't feel it, but because someone has to look like they're not feeling it. For the children, for you, for the structure of it all. You catch her staring out the window sometimes, or at what used to be a window now boarded and sealed. She stands there holding a cup of pine tea, watching snow drift past the corners of the roof like ashes. She doesn't say a word. You don't interrupt. That's her moment, her escape. She keeps journals when she can spare the paper, little notes, lists, sometimes just a word. Alive. You've read over her shoulder once or twice. There's poetry in there, real poetry. You wonder what kind of life she might have had somewhere else, somewhere warmer, somewhere with clean sheets and lemon in her tea. But she chose this, or maybe she didn't. Maybe the world gave her no other options. Either way, she's here, and she's the reason you're here. So you learn to step up, to carry more, to cook sometimes, to watch the fire so she can rest. You teach the older kids how to patch a shirt. You hang the laundry for once. You take over the firewood run, not as a favour, as a recognition. Because in this cabin, in this world where survival is a day-to-day negotiation between wind and warmth, she's not just a helper, she's the centre. You tuck the blankets around her shoulders when she finally falls asleep. You stir the fire quietly so it doesn't wake her. You pour the tea before she asks. And when the storm hits again, because it always does, you stand beside her at the door, shoulder to shoulder, and face it together. The snow never stops. Not really. It pauses, softens, takes a breath. But then it begins again. A gentle dusting becomes a flurry becomes a squall. And before long, it's coming down in sheets, thick as wool and twice as heavy. It piles high against the cabin walls, smothers the woodpile, buries the outhouse, and erases the path to the creek like it was never there. This isn't your first storm, but this one feels different, bigger, heavier, like the sky itself has had enough and decided to come crashing down. You saw it coming, The air went still earlier that day, the way it always does before the sky collapses. The dog grew quiet. The chickens fluffed and nestled deep, refusing to budge from their corner. The fire seemed harder to keep lit, like even it knew something was wrong. By dusk, the horizon disappeared behind a wall of white, and by nightfall you couldn't see 5 feet past the cabin window. You brace. There's nothing else to do. You check everything, shutters sealed, roof supported, firewood stacked high inside. You move the animals closer, if not already living in the same room with you, which they basically are now. You boil water, you gather blankets, you count the matches and whisper a quiet promise to every last one, and then you wait. The wind hits first. A low moan, almost like a warning, then a full-throated howl that shakes the door and hisses through every imperfect seam in the walls. You feel it in your teeth. It presses down on the roof like a giant's hand. Pushing, testing, you check the beams, the rafters. They hold for now, and then the snow joins in. It's not flakes anymore, it's shards. Crystals whipped sideways by a wind that's gone from howling to screaming. You feel it even through the walls, a pulse of fury just inches away. It's like the world outside wants in, wants to crack you open and scatter what's left of you across the white. Inside, it's chaos in slow motion. The fire sputters, the windows rattle. The cold worms its way through every gap, around every nail and every board. You plug them with rags, socks, strips of old fur. It's never enough. The temperature drops anyway. You don't sleep. Nobody does. You take shifts tending the fire, rotating through blankets like tired ghosts. The dog curls tighter. The goat groans in her sleep. The youngest starts to cry, softly, too tired to be loud. You shush them, not with words but with warmth, your hands, your body, your presence. There's a moment around Menard, when the storm is at its worst. The whole cabin groans like it's being pulled apart, the walls bowing with every gust. Snow blasts through the cracks in fine white powder, dusting your table, your boots, the floor. You sweep it again and again like it makes a difference. You consider moving everyone to the root cellar, just in case the roof gives. It's been done before. There's a fringe case from an 1830s blizzard, where a family spent 3 days underground with pickled eggs, a smuggled chicken, and a lantern that lasted just long enough. You're not there yet. But you make a plan just in case. By morning, the storm slows but doesn't stop. It's quieter, more insidious now. The kind of quiet that hides danger under beauty. You crack open the door to check the damage, and it takes all your strength to push it open even a few inches. Snow has drifted up to the top of the doorframe, forming a dense white wall that hisses cold air into your face like a warning. You're snowed in, not figuratively, literally. The cabin has become an island in a sea of snow. The path to the woodpile is gone. The outhouse? Don't even think about it. You can't see more than a foot out the front. You're trapped. For now, the weight of it all starts to sink in. Being snowed in sounds romantic when it's just a phrase. People go back east, write songs about it. They imagine cozy fires, shared blankets, a pot of stew bubbling while laughter bounces off the walls. And sure, you do have a fire. You do have stew. But the laughter? That's harder. There's not much funny about watching the roof groan under 3 feet of packed snow while wondering how long your firewood stack will last. You ration movement. No unnecessary trips across the room. Every step costs body heat. Every open door bleeds warmth. You rearrange the cabin, consolidating everyone and everything near the hearth, forming a tight, warm, somewhat smelly circle of survival. It works, mostly, but food becomes a problem faster than you thought. You had enough for 5 days. The storm's already on day 4 and the snow shows no sign of stopping. You stretch meals, half portions, extra water. Soup that's really just warm broth with the idea of flavour. It's not enough. Everyone feels it. You stop using bowls. No dishes to clean means fewer trips outside with frozen hands. One night someone makes a joke. It's not funny, but everyone laughs anyway. Not because it's good, but because it breaks the silence. Because sometimes laughter is all that keeps fear from setting up shop behind your ribs. You notice things you didn't before. The draft from the western wall. The way one beam creaks when the wind hits just right. The crack in the roof you swore wasn't there last week. The bucket of snow melting by the fire that now tastes faintly like soot and desperation. There's a strange beauty, though, in this kind of confinement. A forced togetherness. No distractions. No running off to fix fences or check traps or argue about the chores. Just you, your people, your animals, and the storm. And in that frozen cocoon you learn things. about each other, about patience, about resilience. You watch the snow rise higher on the windows each day. At some point, it blots out all the light. The cabin becomes a cave. Time warps. You sleep when you're tired, eat when you can, talk when someone breaks the silence. The outside world feels fictional. There is only this. Eventually it ends. Not all at once. The wind dies first. The snow softens. The sky, after days of furious grey, shifts to a pale blue that almost hurts to look at. You dig your way out with a shovel and a hatchet, hacking through snow that feels like packed stone. It takes hours. But when you step out into the open air again, when the sun touches your face, you almost forget how hard it was. Almost. And then you look at the cabin, frost clinging to the roof, the door hanging crooked, the smoke curling up in exhausted spirals, and you feel it. You didn't just survive the storm, you outlasted it. The calendar says March, but you don't believe it. The light stays a little longer each evening, true. There's a softness to the sun that almost feels like a promise. But you've been fooled before, and out here on the frontier, spring is not a gentle arrival. It's a trickster, a flirt. One day it gives you warmth on your back, and the next it buries you in snow so deep you start whispering apologies to the calendar for ever trusting it. You want it to be over, desperately. You want to step outside and smell something other than smoke, animals, or damp wool. You want to see green. Anything green. Even mould at this point would be a welcome splash of colour. But mostly you want to feel warm without having to earn it. Without chopping logs, without adding layers, without huddling like a guilty raccoon by the fire. So when the first thaw comes, it feels like a dream. The icicles dripping. The crunch of snow softening to slush. You catch water running in little rivulets down the hill, and your heart leaps. The sun touches your face for more than 10 minutes, and you close your eyes like some half-thawed lizard, soaking up a divine light. You even shed a layer of clothing, just for an hour. But it feels glorious. Then, of course, comes the betrayal. Because spring doesn't arrive in a straight line. It staggers. It lies. It gives you hope and then yanks it away like a mischievous child. One day it's birdsong and muddy boots. The next, a sudden squall pounds you in the face with wind and wet snow, heavier than anything you remember from December. You can see the buds on the trees, so close to bursting, but they're not stupid. They know better. They wait. You, on the other hand, start to unravel. There's something about almost escaping that breaks a person more than the worst part of winter ever could. You were strong when it was all cold and grey. You expected it. You endured. But this is the emotional equivalent of being halfway out the door and then getting locked inside again. You're so close to making it. But the season just keeps slamming its frosty boot into your back and shoving you down. The food stores are nearly gone now. No more flour. The last of the beans have been scraped from the barrel. The pickles are soft, sour, and suspiciously fizzy. You boiled them anyway. Regret followed shortly after. You eye the seed potatoes, but know you'll need them for planting if the ground ever thaws. You once joked that snow would fall on your grave. Now, you're starting to think that was less of a joke and more of a premonition. Historically, March was often the cruelest month for frontier families. Food at its scarcest, roads still impassable, storms still lurking. They called it the starving time for a reason. There are records of families grinding tree bark into flour substitutes, eating boiled leather from old boots, making tea from pine needles and lies. One account even talks about chewing candle wax for calories. You read that and laughed back in October. You're not laughing now, the animals are stir-crazy too. The goat bleats constantly. The dog just stares at the door like it might will it open into a better world. The chickens? You're not sure if they're molting or plotting a coup, feathers everywhere, no eggs. Just judgmental clucking and little beady eyes that seem to say, this is your fault. Even your body starts playing tricks on you. You feel spring in your muscles. You want to move more, stretch, do things again. But there's nowhere to go. Every time you try to walk beyond the cabin, the snow collapses beneath your boots and soaks your socks with icy slush. There's no traction, just slop and frostbite. You get reckless, a little wild. You think, maybe I'll just take a walk anyway. Maybe if you pretend it's spring, it'll become spring. You step outside, no hat, coat half buttoned. 5 minutes later, your ears are numb, your boots are full of water, and your courage has frozen somewhere near your ankles. You drag yourself back inside, defeated by a month that's neither winter nor spring, but a kind of cursed in-between purgatory. One quirky settler's journal from the Dakotas describes March as the month when mud has the consistency of cake batter and your hope turns sour like bad milk. That feels about right. Still, there are signs. You try not to be superstitious, but you notice the ice on the creek is thinning. You spot a single bird, not the big grumpy winter crows, but something smaller, flightier. A promise with feathers. One morning the wind shifts, warmer, damp, not bitter. You don't trust it, but you feel it. There's something deeply emotional about hearing the first drip from the eaves after weeks of silence. It's just water. But to you, it sounds like music, like progress. Like the world beginning to remember that life exists outside of survival. You open the cabin door just a little wider now. Let the air in even if it's still cold. You sweep the floor even though it'll just get dirty again. You find your seed packets and go through them with grim hope. Planning, dreaming. Maybe next week you can start something, maybe. But you don't let yourself believe it fully yet. Not until the snow is truly gone. Not until the mud dries and the first green thing pokes through and doesn't get covered again the next day by a freak snowstorm. Until then, you hold on, you watch the skies, you ration what's left, you tell yourself stories, you remind the others that every storm has an end, even if it lies. Because the cruelest part of the frontier winter isn't January, it's the lie of March. Then one morning it happens, not with a roar or a fanfare, or even an announcement, just subtly, quietly, like the world changing its mind. You open the door, expecting the usual blast of damp cold or that uniquely hateful smell of late-season slush, but instead you smell dirt. Actual dirt. Not mud, not rot. Earth. Warm, slightly sweet, real. You stand there barefoot on the wooden threshold, blinking into the pale sunlight like some creature emerging from a cave. The snow has receded enough to see patches of brown. Not green, not yet, but brown. That feels like a miracle all on its own. The top layer of the garden bed is soft. You press a finger into it. It gives way, damp, crumbly, eager. After months of ice and fire and silence, the world has started whispering again. Spring, the real kind, doesn't arrive like a parade. It arrives like a quiet exhale, like a held breath, finally released. You don't even notice the exact moment when the snow vanishes from the path, but one day your boots hit packed earth instead of ice. One day the animals start poking their noses out and not immediately regretting it. One day, you open the window and leave it open. Of course, it's still cold, the mornings are sharp, the night's biting. But there's a difference in the cold now. It no longer feels permanent. You can feel the sun fighting it. The days stretch. Light creeps further into the corners of the cabin. There's warmth in the beams again. You stop living in a tight huddle around the hearth. You start sitting near the door. It's planting season. That phrase used to mean little to you, just a chore, a word on a calendar. Now it feels like salvation. The act of taking something tiny, pressing it into the earth and believing, truly believing that something will come from it. That's faith. And you're desperate for faith. You take stock of your seeds. You know them like old friends now. Beans, carrots, kale, some squash that might be too ambitious, but hope makes you reckless. You hold each packet like it's made of gold. These aren't just seeds. They're next winter's survival insurance. You dig with frozen fingers and sore knees, still sore from sleeping on too many hard floors and not enough blankets. You turn the soil, you clear the old dead stalks. You work in silence because it feels sacred. The dog lays nearby, soaking up the sun like a solar panel for joy. Even the chickens stop their constant judgment and begin scratching the thawed dirt with what you choose to interpret as approval. There's a moment, maybe the first truly peaceful moment in months, when you pause, hands in the soil, breath coming easy, sun on your face, and you realise you're alive. You made it, not unscarred, not unchanged, but alive. And that's no small thing. You think of those who didn't, of the stories you read, the cabins that never opened again, the beds that stayed empty. You remember the storm nights, the hunger, the fire that almost got out of control, the strange man knocking in the dark. You remember the days when you were sure your body couldn't take another hour of cold. And you remember her, the woman who held it all together. You glance toward the cabin, where she's hanging laundry for the first time in months, her sleeves rolled, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright again. She catches your look and raises an eyebrow like she's reading your thoughts and already bored of them. You grin. She doesn't grin back, she never does, but she nods. That's enough. Inside, you've started cleaning, not just tidying, but reclaiming. Washing soot from the walls, scrubbing floors that haven't seen daylight since November. You throw out the bucket you kept for emergencies with small sombre ceremony. You repurpose the box of rags into actual cleaning cloths instead of makeshift insulation. The whole cabin feels lighter, as if it knows the fight is over. You even let yourself dream again, about fixing the roof properly, about adding another window, about raising a second pig so the first one finally has someone else to grunt at. The world is wide again and you can feel it calling. Historically, frontier families treated spring not with celebration, but with cautious joy. They knew how cruel the season could be. Floods, late frosts, sicknesses that bloomed in the thaw. But they also knew it was the time to build again, to rebuild, really. Because winter didn't just pause life, it shattered it. Spring was the glue. One quirky entry from an 1851 homesteader notes that the first day I hung laundry without it freezing stiff made me weep into the bread dough. You understand that kind of joy now. It's not dramatic, it's just human. You celebrate with the smallest feast, what's left of the last smoked meat, a fresh egg, and a pancake made from desperation and a pinch of hope. It tastes better than anything you had all winter. You eat it outside, perched on a stump like it's a royal banquet. There's work ahead. You're behind on planting, the fence needs mending, the roof still leaks, the creek is rising a little too fast, and your boots are still full of holes. You need more salt, more oil, more everything, but none of that scares you. Because the cold is gone, the dark is broken, and now you get to build. There's a strange ache that comes when the worst is over. Not physical though, your joints are stiff, and your back has the familiar curve of someone who's spent too many months hauling, chopping, bending, surviving. No, this ache is emotional. It sits behind your ribs and hums like a tuning fork. It's the realization that somehow you're not fighting for your life anymore. Not today anyway. And when the fight fades, you're left with you and everything you've been holding off feeling. The first few days of true spring are filled with noise, not from people, you're still in the middle of nowhere, but from the world itself. The thaw is loud. It drips and trickles and runs in rivulets down hillsides. The creeks are swollen, and the wind doesn't scream anymore, it sings. Birds return in waves, as if the sky opened and dropped them back where they belonged. Even the trees seem to exhale, creaking and swaying as they stretch from their long frozen sleep. You stand in the middle of it, watching the cabin shrink behind you as you walk toward the edge of your tiny known world. The same path you trudged in snowshoes 3 months ago now squishes underfoot, full of mud and promise. The same trees that once loomed in white silence now shimmer with tiny buds, so small you could miss them if you weren't paying attention. But you are. Now, more than ever, you find yourself touching everything. A leaf, a rock warmed by sun, the bark of a tree, not for any practical reason, just to prove it's all real, that the nightmare season has passed and the world is letting you back in. You don't rush, you walk slowly like someone relearning the shape of the earth. The animals are different too. The chickens begin laying again, almost apologetically. The goat walks farther, sniffing everything like it's new. Even the pig, still smug, still muddy, grunts with something like satisfaction as he sunbathes in a dry patch of grass you didn't think would exist ever again. And you begin to do something radical. Rest. Not collapse, not pass out from exhaustion, but rest. Sit in a chair for more than 5 minutes. Stare at the trees. Close your eyes in the sun without a voice in your head screaming, "Get up! The fire's low, you're behind on kindling, there's a draft somewhere." The silence becomes soothing, not alarming. You stop jumping at every sound. You stop checking the windows every few minutes, scanning for wolves, raiders, the cold itself. You let your guard down, a little. There's an emotional detox that happens after surviving a winter like that. The body recovers faster than the mind, and physically you're eating better, moving easier, sleeping deeper. But mentally, you still find yourself flinching at shadows. You still wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, only to realise the fire's burning fine and no one's dying. It's hard to explain to someone who's never lived through it. The way fear burrows in, the way survival becomes not just something you do, but something you are. And then, suddenly, it's not needed. You're still braced, but nothing's coming. There's no storm, no cold, just wind and light and the faint smell of blossoms. One morning you catch your reflection in a puddle. You almost don't recognise it. Your face is leaner. The lines are deeper. But your eyes, they're awake in a way they weren't a few months ago. Like the part of you that went underground for the winter has returned, blinking in the light, slightly disoriented but very much alive. You remember the mistakes you made. The fire that almost took the cabin, the time you rationed food too tightly and everyone went to bed hungry, the trap that didn't work. The deal you almost made with a stranger you didn't trust. The bottle you dipped into too many nights. You carry those things, not with shame, at least not entirely, but with honesty. Because survival isn't clean, it's dirty and reactive and instinctual. You did what you had to, and you learned. Every mistake became a notch on your ribs. Every lesson etched into the grain of your axe handle. You made it, and now you begin again. You start fixing what broke, patching leaks in the roof, replacing window coverings with real glass if you can scrounge it. You plan your planting with more precision than ever. You even sketch a new shed you might build in the summer, now that you know how small and vulnerable your storage really was. And the people, the ones in your cabin, they change too, slowly. The kids start laughing louder. The woman, your wife, your partner, your anchor, sings again while kneading dough. A tune you haven't heard since before the snow. You hum along off-key and she rolls her eyes, but she doesn't stop. You begin trading again. Real trading. Not desperate, late winter bartering for dry beans and rabbit fur, but neighbourly exchanges, seeds, tools, news. You hear stories of others who made it and those who didn't. You grieve quietly, privately, but you also celebrate. One quirky fact from a 19th century journal: frontier families would sometimes mark the true end of winter with a picnic, even if they had nothing to eat but dry bread and warm water. Just the act of sitting in the sun together, outside, was enough. A symbol, a line drawn between what was and what will be. You do your own version, a bench, a cup of fresh tea, the sun, a distance that feels earned. And in that moment you realise something else. You didn't just survive the coldest nights. You earned the right to live through the warm ones. You built this life through mistakes, sweat, ingenuity, and sheer refusal to die. No one back east will ever understand what that cost. How close you came to disappearing, but you'll know. Every time the wind shifts and carries the scent of sap and soil instead of death, you'll know. And now that spring's here, and truly here, not just whispering empty promises behind frozen clouds, you finally rest easy. Not because you're done. No one on the frontier is ever done, but because you've proven that you can do this. When the cold howled, you stayed warm. When the food ran low, you stretched it. When the dark crept in, you lit a fire and kept it alive. This life, it isn't pretty, it's not romantic, but it's real, and it's yours. Next winter will come again, it always does. But now, you won't fear it the same way. You'll remember the warmth you made from nothing, the soup you conjured from scraps, the laughter that still rose in a one-room cabin, half buried in snow. And when the nights grow long again, you'll light your fire, pull on your beaver fur mittens and smile, because you've been through worse. You'll stir the stew, check the windows and settle in, not with dread, but with memory, because you survived the coldest nights. And now you sleep in warmth you earned.